Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Al-Qasta, I'm glad to have all of you here today. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this important human rights conference, which comprises three sessions attached with discussions. And allow me to use this opportunity to highlight the most argumentative, prevailing topic today, the World Cup in Qatar. I believe we also and read how Qatar succeeded in hiding its poor human rights record behind the excuse of respecting the other people's religion and traditions. And also we saw the racism in the Western media or some Western media and the hypocrisy of the FIFA. There are people, unfortunately, trying to make human rights a lifestyle that is related to specific nations, races, or even religions. Well, they are not. Human rights belong to humanity and the humanity only. For me, as a human rights activist who fled his country 10 years ago, it is a huge disappointment that we failed to use this opportunity not just to highlight the poor human rights conditions in Qatar, but also in all Gulf countries. A huge disappointment as we failed to use this big occasion to win international solidarity that could help us to make a difference. In contrast, I believe it is also an opportunity to learn, understand, and to unite all together as a global human rights community and not to rely on people who use us or our cause to serve their own interests. Some friends contacting me asking me to keep silent and to not criticize the Qatari regime as they have more popularity than any other Gulf regimes. Some of them the same who asked me before or previously to keep silent when the last monarch of Oman passed away. And here allow me to show my disagreement, which it is a principle, not just a difference of opinion. We should say that what we have to say, no matter what the circumstances are, or it is the right time or not, because in human rights, there is no right or wrong time. There is only one time always. As tomorrow is the Human Rights International Day, it is also marks my 10th anniversary since I left my beloved country, Oman, and it is also my last day as an executive director of Al-Qust for Human Rights. Thank you, Yahya, for giving me this opportunity to work with a distinguished team, Julia, Josh, Lena, Abdullah, and Sue. In the end, I would like to conclude with an African saying as a message to all my human rights defenders and activists. If you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. And now I will ask my colleague Julia to join me. She is the new executive director of Al-Qust. Julia is a political scientist and a human rights professional over 9 years. Please, Julia.
Thank you, Napan, and a warm welcome from me to everyone in the audience and to everyone watching online. First of all, let me say a big thank you, Napan, to you and what you have done for Al-Qist over the last year and a half, but also the support you gave to the organizations for many years before as a close ally. And of course, I'm very honored and humbled to be entrusted this position, and I look forward to working with the excellent team at Al-Qist, and I pledge that I will do everything in my ability to continue defending and promoting human rights in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf region, and the wider MENA region. But let us now turn to today's event and this conference, which will reflect on what has happened in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf over the last year. What are the new trends? What have we learned? And what does that leave us with looking forward into the next year? So let me welcome and hand over the microphone to my dear colleague, Lina, Al-Qist, Head of Monitoring and Communications. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lina Al-Hadroul. I'm head of monitoring and communication at Al-Qist. So the first panel we'll have today is about the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia in general. I mean, it's very important now that the Saudi government has gone through the murder of Khashoggi with all impunity, that their PR machine is working again. So we have three distinguished panelists, Dr. Abdullah Al-Auda, the lawyer Taha Al-Haji, and our founder Yahya Asiri. So maybe first of all, I'll start with Dr. Abdullah Al-Auda, and maybe I'll just mention the fact that Taha will be speaking in Arabic, and I will be translating. So please be nice with me. I've never done this, so hopefully all will be okay. So first of all, Dr. Abdullah Al-Auda is the Gulf director at Dawn, and he is also the Secretary General of NAS, which is the first opposition political party outside Saudi Arabia, of course. So, Dr. Abdullah, I'll start with you. So, as since 2017, we've seen many changes, and Dawn has done an impressive job documenting many of the issues on the ground in Saudi Arabia. I think that one of the most, I would say, impressive pages they have on their website is the culprits gallery, which basically gives a name and a face to violators of human rights in Saudi Arabia, people with a high profile. And they've also documented the Jeddah demolitions and so many other issues. So, Dr. Abdullah, could you maybe give us a brief overview of the human rights situation on the ground, from freedom of expression to the arbitrary arrests? And I think it's very important also to mention the changes in the judiciary that you have documented, including the arrest of judges.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Lena. Well, first of all, as you noticed, since 2017, when MBS came to power, the concentration of power changed in Saudi Arabia from more horizontal kind of succession to more vertical. All powers just have become in the hand of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And you have noticed all the changes regarding the counter-terrorism law, the counter-terrorism court, and also how the state security is being was restructured to be under the royal court. So all that happened right after MBS came to power. I think what developed in the past few months and 1 year and a half is this appetite for more for harsher sentences against human rights defenders, women activists, against peaceful lawyers, and the like. And I think what happened is that Mohammed bin Salman, has been using basically the specialized criminal court, which was supposed to be quote unquote the counter-terrorism court, to try human rights defenders, peaceful activists, and the like. But he was not happy even with that kind of harsh treatment of activists and defenders and intellectuals. So what happened is that he brought the very prosecutors that actually were documenting, were actually providing the files against these defenders, and who were seeking the harshest sentences against all these human rights defenders and activists, and basically appointed them in the court in order to facilitate these kind of sentences. And I think this kind of marked a shift toward a more brutal treatment of human rights defenders in the judiciary. That's when we started hearing Salma Shihab got like 34 years in prison, and then Noor Al-Qahtani getting 45 years in prison, and then we get Osama Khalid, and then we get Al-Hwaiti, and then we get, and then it goes on and on and on. It's like 50 years, and then we started hearing like 65 years, 70 years sentences. These are like sentences that are unprecedented, even compared to the harsh and brutal treatment of human rights defenders in prison and in court. So I think this is one of the major shifts, and that's why we thought that yes, documenting human rights is really, really important and essential, and it should be done. It's just the basis for doing the work. But also to go on the offensive is important, and that's why we created the idea of culprit gallery, as you mentioned, Lena. The idea of the culprit gallery basically is to go from just defending human rights activists, intellectuals, and the like, to going on the offensive against these violators. Basically, one, to expose them, meaning to document all the violations that they have done, put their picture out there, even tweet against them on Twitter, basically doing a campaign against them. Secondly, going further to employ every available mechanism to sanction them. And we have done that in multiple cases. And I'll just give a quick example of the case of Salah Al-Jdaili, who was involved in many violations, and the Magnitsky file was submitted to the State Department in order to include him in the sanctions. Another case was Al-Hussein, Ibrahim Al-Hussein, who actually harassed activists in the US. So we included that, and we submitted a Khashoggi ban against him. So we try to employ every available mechanism internationally in order to take these culprits from just being on the website and being just a campaign on social media to more like legal mechanism and trying to employ all these sanctions and bans that are available to us. So the idea is to try to create a breakthrough of some sort, meaning yes, we documenting human rights and also monitoring the situation is important. But as long as we just defending the human rights and all that, people will not take us seriously unless we go on the offensive. Unless we expose these people with their names. Every judge that has sentenced a human rights defender should be exposed. Their history and their sentences should be published, and then this should be a basis to submit for an international sanction against everyone who is involved. And this, of course, should apply in the first place to the state security personnel, those who were responsible for arrests, for search, meaning illegal search, arbitrary arrests, interrogations, torture, solitary confinement, and you name it. So the idea is to expose these names, these people, believe me, this has worked a lot in many cases where judges actually decided to try to delete every information about them on the internet. We have seen cases where people trying to delete their pictures, where information that were available about state security individuals through Twitter were just deleted. We have seen so many examples, and I have heard from a judge that even the Minister of Justice himself has picked the phone and called many judges saying, you embarrassed us, you just put us in this situation where we have to defend everything, and your names and information are all over the place and all that. So I think this is why this part is important. I don't want to go longer than I should, so I will leave it to other panelists.
Of course, Abdullah. Is it okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. Yeah, I think that actually it is working, because what we've noticed as well is that judges don't even want to have their names on court documents anymore, which is quite impressive, actually, and it means that your work is working. Another thing is that in this seeking justice and putting an end to impunity, Dawn has also filed a complaint in the US for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi against MBS. We recently learned that it won't go further than that because the US government decided, or mentioned the fact that MBS is now prime minister and that he has immunity. So does Dawn think about going on, appealing? And if you could also maybe briefly talk about the trial in France as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Lena. Well, yes. So the legal complaint that we filed in the U.S. in 2020 was another mechanism of trying to hold the perpetrators in the Khashoggi murder accountable. And we included information that were never published before from interviews that we have done. And, even when we filed in the beginning, we have never foreseen how shaken the Saudi government by this, because they have done everything possible in order to take it down. They have pressured countries actually to intervene in order to pressure parties to the lawsuit to just drop it. They have, even talked to the U.S. and actually offered the U.S. that they should be given legal immunity when they negotiating oil back in February 2022. So see how MBS is just obsessed with the legal cases against him internationally, and changing the whole system in Saudi Arabia and making himself prime minister is just another example that he just messed up with the whole system in order to protect himself and to provide just a legal mechanism for him to be given legal immunity, and made himself prime minister. I mean, in the lawsuit itself, just imagine staff from the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. were brought in order to give testimonies against us. Salah Khashoggi was dragged into this and probably was forced into writing even a statement on this. Khalid bin Salman, who is the defense prime minister, also wrote a declaration and a statement in court in our lawsuit just to try to dispute some basic facts that we provide in the lawsuit when Khashoggi met with Khalid bin Salman back in the day. So see how the Saudi government employed everything, and then the last, possibly the last nail in the coffin was when they actually brought the highest legal authority in the kingdom, Al-Ajaji, Muhammad bin Sulaiman Al-Ajaji, who is the head of the Council of Experts to the Council of Ministers, and who is a member of the basic laws committee in the royal court to give testimony about why a prime minister should be protected and immune from any cases internationally. So you see how they were so fragile. They have tried to employ everything possible, and that's just should give us more motive to continue and to fight, even if we know the chances are now lower. But it's not just in this court. As you said, we have filed another lawsuit in France. And in France, it's not going to be just a civil lawsuit, but actually a criminal lawsuit if the prosecutor is convinced enough of the case. And we hope this is the case. So we will fight, and it's not just in court. We will use court. We'll use international sanctions available to us in order to include everyone who is responsible for this. We will use the media, the campaign exposure. We will use everything possible to continue the fight and the struggle until Mohammed bin Salman is brought to justice and every other perpetrator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. Well, thank you for all your work. Really, it's needed, and I think that it is impactful, it is effective, and inshallah, we'll celebrate the end together one day. Now to Taha. So I will ask the questions in English. He knows, I think, already, or he understands, and I will be translating. So Taha is really focused on, I would say, death sentences mostly. He is one of the most informed people abroad about what is going on regarding death sentences in Saudi Arabia. So maybe my first question is, so since maybe 2015 to 2017, many reforms were announced regarding the death penalties. What were they, and have they been implemented?
مرحبا لينا وشكرا على الاستضافة وأمسي على الجميع بالخير. في البداية خلينا نضع المسميات الصحيحة، لأن هناك هي الكثير من الوعود والتصريحات، هي خلينا نسميها تصريحات وليست إصلاحات. عدد كبير من التصريحات الحكومية والوعود، ولكن ما يتم تنفيذه قليل. الواقع أن الحكومة السعودية بقدرتها المالية وقوتها الإعلامية تستطيع يعني إقناع الناس بأن هذه التصريحات التي نثرت سواء على تويتر أو في الهواء أو في إعلانات طبقت وأصبحت حقيقة على أرض الواقع. يعني مع استمرار هذه لأي مراقب يلاحظ أنه مع استمرار هذه التصريحات إلا أن أعداد الإعدامات تزداد باستمرار. مثلا في أبريل 2018 محمد بن سلمان ولي العهد صرح في مقابلة مع صحيفة التايم أن هناك عمل على بناء قوانين جديدة تستهدف خفض أعداد الإعدامات بشكل كبير. في 2019 بعد التصريح وصلنا إلى أكبر رقم مسجل في عدد الإعدامات التي نفذت في السعودية. في أغسطس أيضا صدر قانون للأحداث وينص ويحدد العقوبات التي يمكن أن تطبق على القاصرين، واستثنى عقوبة القتل التعزيري للقاصرين. بعدها بأشهر في مارس 2019 في عملية إعدام جماعية كان من ضمنهم عدد من القاصرين. تحبي أكمل ولا الترجمة؟
So to answer this, he says that there's a lot of promises, and he doesn't want us to call them reforms. It's mainly promises, and the implementation of these promises are very low. It's mainly big PR. While they promise that they'll be working on new laws to lower the number of executions, what we see concretely on the ground, reports that there's an explosion of executions. For example, he gave the example of in April 2018, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Times Magazine said that they're working on new laws to try and reduce the number of executions. But then later in 2019, there was the biggest number of executions ever. Another example he gives is that August of that year, they said that they will be working on laws to end the ta'zir executions on minors, but later that year, minors were actually executed.
ما يعني الحكومة أحيانا هي تفضح نفسها بنفسها. ففي مارس 2020 صدر أمر ملكي بضرورة تطبيق قانون الأحداث وعدم قتل القاصرين. يعني أنت عندك قانون، يوجد قانون يمنع، لماذا لا تلتزم به الأجهزة القضائية أو أجهزة الدولة بمختلف توجهاتها؟ لماذا تحتاج إلى قانون، إلى أمر ملكي يلزمك بتطبيق قانون صدر في 2018؟ ومن صدور القانون إلى صدور الأمر الملكي زهقت أرواح بلا مبرر يعني. ولذلك لأننا أمام دولة يعني ليست دولة قانون، ليست دولة مؤسسات، القرارات فيها مزاجية، فنحن نحتاج إلى أمر ملكي يلزمنا بتطبيق القوانين الموجودة. هذا كان في 2020. وبعد هذا الأمر الملكي أيضا تم تنفيذ يعني عمليات قتل لبعض القاصرين.
معلش بس ممكن أترجم؟
يلا.
So he says that it's quite funny or ironic that the country exposes itself sometimes. For example, he gives the fact that there's a law that forbids from executing minors, but then they have to have a royal decree confirming that. So it's almost like they're saying we're not a country where the rule of law reigns, that you have to have a royal decree to confirm things. So basically saying that, they're basically confirming that they're not a state of institution.
واستمرت التصريحات تتوالى. يعني هيئة حقوق الإنسان في يناير 2021 يعني أصدرت بيان نشرته، يعني تتباهى وتتغنى فيه أنه في عام 2020 كانت أقل نسبة إعدامات سجلت في السعودية، وأنه تم إيقاف الإعدامات في القضايا الغير خطيرة، قضايا المخدرات، لأنه في عام 2020 كان هناك فقط 27 عملية إعدام. فيعني هم أصدروا بيان تفاخر واعتزاز أن الإصلاحات كانت هذه ثمرتها. ولكن وجدنا بعد ذلك استئناف وإعادة عمليات الإعدام في قضايا المخدرات التي علقت لسنتين و11 شهر ثم أعيد تنفيذها. والعدد كان العدد يعتبر قليل في 2020، لكن في السنة التي بعدها في 21 و22 وصلنا إلى أرقام عالية جدا.
As well, they have been bragging in 2020 of the low number of executions, and mentioning the fact that they are working on stopping the death penalties for drug-related offenses, and which was true in 2020. There was a low, in Saudi Arabia, 27 executions, and so they were, publishing statements where they were bragging about it and being proud of this achievement. But then we saw that in 2021, 2022, there were retrials for drug-related offenses, which led to death penalties.
نعم يعني آخر التصريحات هي تصريحات محمد بن سلمان شخصيا في صحيفة أتلانتيك، وصرح بوضوح أن عقوبة القتل سوف تقتصر فقط وتحدد في قضايا التي تنص الشريعة على، يعني يتكلم عن قضايا القتل، عن قضايا القصاص، وقال هذا أمر ليس بيدنا وكان تصريح واضح بذلك. والآن احنا تجاوزنا عدد 1000 شخص قتل في عهد الملك سلمان لوحده رغم كل هذه التصريحات.
So he says that MBS during in an interview in the Atlantic said that we will have death penalties only for what is stated in the Sharia, which is basically murders. But then what we see is that in the reign of King Salman only, we have reached the number of 1,000 death sentences.
تمام. لكن لازم احنا نوضح ان في قضايا كان هناك فيها خطوه ايجابيه، بعض يعني بعض القضايا بعض الامور اخذنا خطوه للامام ورجعنا خطوتين للخلف، بعضها خطوه للامام وتوقفنا. مثلا في قانون القاصرين، في قانون الاحداث صدر القانون بمنع قتل القاصرين، وفعلا تم الغاء بعض الاحكام وتغيير بعض الطلبات الاعدام لهم، فاصبح الموضوع اشد تعقيد على الحكومه. يعني لكي هي متعطشه للقتل، هي تريد ان تقتل، لا توجد اراده سياسيه حقيقيه وجاده للايقاف. ولكن هذا القانون اصبح حجر عثره في طريقها. مع ذلك نجد انها تتحايل على هذه القوانين. فالان حسب الرصد هناك عدد من القاصرين صدرت ضدهم احكام اعدام، ولكن الحكومه لا تذكر انهم قاصرين بالفعل، فهم يبقون في السجن الى ان يتجاوزوا 18 سنه وتوجه لهم اتهامات. وحسب النص في الاحكام انه وقت اعتقال الشخص كان عمره 18 سنه وما فوق، ولكن التهمه التي يتهم بها بعضهم كانت في سن 12 سنه او 13 او 15 سنه، وتطالب النيابه بقتلهم رغم ان هذه الاعمال قاموا بها وهم قاصرون.
So he says that there has been positive steps. We go sometimes with positive steps, but then they go back. And what is interesting to know is that the government wants to execute. So what they do is that they play basically with the laws and how they implement them. So for example, when it comes to the death sentences against minors, they imprison them and they don't execute them until they reach the age of 18. Although the charges are based on acts they did when they were minors. And one case is a minor who was 12 years old who is on death row, but that they waited until he reached the age of 18.
نعم، في الأخير احنا وجدنا في الأيام الأخيرة خلال شهر نوفمبر الماضي عودة مفاجئة ومباغتة للسعودية في تنفيذ عمليات الإعدام في قضايا المخدرات، رغم أنها احتفلت وابتهجت أن تلك العقوبات أوقفت أو جمدت يعني، واستمر التجميد تقريبا قرابة 3 سنوات. لكن تفاجأنا بدون أي مبرر، لأن نسبة قضايا المخدرات ليست قليلة من بين قضايا الإعدامات، واستئنافها أكيد راح يرفع الأعداد مرة أخرى.
He says is that Saudi Arabia has increased its number of executions, and especially for drug-related offenses, when they had promised to stop them, and they had actually suspended it for more than 2 years, and now they're back at it. معلش طه إذا ما ترجم كل شيء.
تمام. ايضا بالنسبه للاجراءات التي تقوم بها السعوديه اثناء وقبل وبعد عمليه القتل، هي اجراءات غير انسانيه ابدا. فهي عندما تنفذ هذه الاحكام لا تعطي فرصه للمنفذ للشخص يعني الذي تريد قتله بان يودع عائلته او يكتب الوصيه او حتى زياره وداع. وأيضا وصلت فيهم الوقاحة إلى درجة أنها بعد التنفيذ لا تكلف نفسها أو تكلف أحد المسؤولين أو أحد الضباط أو أي شخص أن يذهب للعائلة بطريقة إنسانية مؤدبة محترمة فيها شوية إحساس ويبلغهم بعملية التنفيذ، بل يتركوا ليتلقوا الخبر من وسائل الإعلام أو على السوشيال ميديا أو رسالة واتساب أو غيره، فيكون في حالة من عدم التصديق وحالة من عدم اليقين. بعض الأشخاص، احنا نعرف بعض الأشخاص إلى الآن هو مو مقتنع أنه تم إعدام أبوه أو ابنه أو أخيه أو غيره، لأن يقول لك أنا لا شفت إعدام ولا سمعت ولا استلمت ولا يوجد جثة إلى الآن ولا يوجد قبر، فيبقوا في حالة نفسية مضطربة وفي حالة تشكيك، وهذا شيء قاسي جدا سواء بالنسبة للعوائل أو بالنسبة حتى للمراقبين.
And the way the executions are implemented before and after the execution is really inhumane. First of all, the chance for the accused or the person who is going to be executed to see his family, to talk to them, to say goodbye. And not only that, even after the person has been executed, there is no one from the official or the government or the officials that goes to the family in a respectful way to inform them of this death sentence. And sometimes the families don't even get the corpse, so they don't even have proof of this death sentence. Some of them learn about their relatives' murder, death sentence through social media or on the news, which leaves them in a state of shock, and sometimes they can't even believe it, or they don't want to really accept it, basically.
في النهاية بس عشان نترك وقت لأبو فارس، أخذنا من وقته بسبب الترجمة، نأكد أن هذه العمليات الإعدام يعني في توسع، وما زال الوضع حتى بالنسبة للقاصرين رغم صدور قانون وأمر ملكي ما زال هناك يعني تحايل على هذه القوانين. لا توجد إرادة فعلية حقيقية يعني الحد من عمليات الإعدام وقصرها على الجرائم الأشد خطورة، بل هناك تساهل وتلاعب، خاصة إذا عرفنا أن القضاء أصلا هو قضاء غير مستقل وغير عادل وغير نزيه. فإحنا نتأمل من هذه الضغوط والاستمرار في هذه الضغوط أن تؤدي ثمارها إن شاء الله في التقليل أو الحد أو منع هذه العمليات. شكرا لكم.
So just to conclude, says that these executions are ongoing and they're on the rise. There is no real will of the government to stop them. There is no independent and fair trials. And he finishes with a positive note, but that our efforts all collectively will hopefully bring their fruits and that we can seek justice. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Taha. It's very interesting, and thank you for your work. It's very needed, and I'm sorry to hear all of these details. Now to Yahya. Yahya is the founder of Al-Qist. He is also the former Secretary General of the NAS opposition party. Yahya, I mean, since I've met him, he's always talked about the importance of institutional work. So I think that it's important for you, Yahya, to explain what first is the state of institutions in Saudi Arabia, and why do you think that it's important to work within an institutional framework when it comes to human rights?
Thank you very much, Lena. Thank you for Abdullah, Taha, and Al-Qist and the audience. The big issue in our country that it's not the state for the institutions. It's not just dictator regime, but also it is the regime for the woman. So at this moment, we can see all the decisions coming from whether MBS or his father. And in the past, who was in the position as a king or crown prince, he was the person taking the decision. on behalf of everyone in the country, not just on behalf of the people, but also on behalf of the governments. So if you have ministers in Saudi Arabia, the ministers also in Saudi Arabia, they do nothing. They just doing what, acting on behalf of the king or of the crown prince. At this moment, if I ask any one of you as expert here about the name of the ministers in Saudi Arabia, most of you will not know the names. And we never mentioned the names because they do nothing. They just acting as they ask to act. And not just about the government. So when we criticize the government in Saudi Arabia, sometimes it is not the accurate thing to talk about the government itself, because the minister is there and the ministers there, they don't have they are not the decision makers in the country. And not just about the governments, but also all the institutions in the country. It's nothing. So the decision maker, the ruler, the king or the crown prince, he can take any decision at any time. And the royal decree, as Lina and Taha, Abdullah, they mentioned already, the royal decree is more important than anything in the country. There is no constitution, there is no parliament, there is nothing at all. Also, the main thing and the most important thing is the royal decree, and what the king or the ruler want to say. This is inside the country about the state itself, and the situation is more worse about the civil society and institutions. We don't have the idea for the civil society and institutions inside the country. We don't have the independent organizations and the independent unions acting on behalf of the people. So that's lack, and this huge gap inside the country. We need, at least from outside out the country, to fill these gaps as much as possible. Why the institutional work is very important in our case, because if we don't have it inside the country, we need to build anything outside to fill these gaps. Having organizations like Al-Qist, like Dawn, like the European Center, this is very important to have people working together to defend the people inside the country, to defend their rights with institutional work. For example, maybe for me or for Lina or for any Saudi human rights defender, Abdullah, for example, or any Saudi human rights defender, maybe it's very important for the defender himself to defend the rights for people. But if the defender himself stopped for any reason, he changed his mind, he died, he disappeared from the atmosphere anytime, or he have been arrested if he inside the country, what will happen? Most of the work will stop. And we have heard the picture for Dr. Abdullah Al-Hamid. He did amazing job, amazing efforts he did inside the country. He spent all of his life defending the human rights. All of his life, he was between defending the human rights, asking for constitution for the country, asking for the basic human rights, and back to the prisons all the time. He died inside the prison. Unfortunately, he did lots of things, including establishing ACPRA, but ACPRA not acting inside the country at this moment. Most of the members inside prisons, even the people they have their sentence have finished, like Dr. Mohammed Al-Qahtani, is still in forced disappearance now. So this lack and these difficulties will make the efforts from the human rights defenders maybe have shelf life or expiry date. Maybe there is some people loyal for them and they can keep going and trying to keep their work and efforts to keep it visible and keep it available. But if there is no institutional concrete work to keep these efforts and to keep these thoughts, people will forget. The new generation will not learn about Al-Hamid or Al-Qahtani or any of these works. So having that activity institutional and build the institution for that will make things longer and more concrete and more available, and because also there is something very important mentioned by our great speakers, because of the huge PR for our country, from our regime, and the large amount of money all around the world. Our voices is not heard everywhere, unfortunately. So maybe some people concerned about human rights, they will know about ACRA and they will know about their efforts and the women rights defenders and what's happening inside the country. But lots of people around the world, they will say, yeah, we went to the country, we have seen nothing wrong. We have seen people, they are happy. And as one person mentioned one day, he was in the team with Donald Trump when he went to Saudi Arabia. He said he have not seen anyone executed or have not seen any execution, or also have not seen anyone protesting in the street. Nothing at all. Have not seen anything. So this stupidity, it's available in the world, and there's people, they decided to be stupid because they want to stand with the regime. They want to stand with the dictators. So it is stupidity by choice. And this is available around the world. And we have seen that also the media, with the officials everywhere. To make our voice stronger, we need to build the institutions for that. To try to stop people around the world to say, yeah, there is violations, but Saudis, they have not paid the price yet for their freedom. No, they paid the price. The prisons are full. And they keep building new prisons. Every year they are building new prisons because the Saudis, they are paying the price. And we are losing our friends. We lost Jamal Khashoggi, and everyone knows about his story in the world. But the people around the world, they heard about Jamal because he was in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, but they not heard or talked about Abdullah al-Hamid. They have not talked about Musa al-Qarni. He died inside prison. And not just that, but also not everyone knows about Saud al-Hashimi. He arrested in 2006 or 2007, and he sentenced for 30 years in prison. And the first crime for Saud al-Hashimi, he want to change the regime. What is the matter if he want to change the regime? And the people defending Saud al-Hashimi, they said, no, he don't want to change the regime. And I have seen the court document. I don't think there is enough evidence that Saud al-Hashimi and his team want to change the regime. And there is nothing strong to say that. However, if that's what he was working in and his team, what's the issue to change the regime? In free country and democratic country, they are attempt to change the regime by vote, and that's it. So it's not big deal, but it's become as a huge crime, even within the human rights society. Some people, they don't think about it. It's not huge. It's not wrong at all to try to change the regime or to try to get rid of the dictators. So this is why I believe the institutional work and building the institutions outside the country is very important, and also to enhance the institutional state inside the country. Maybe starting from now to push for that, or maybe at least to build it in the future. We have seen in the Arab Spring, people, they went to the streets and they asked for great things, freedom, justice, but we failed as Arab. From Egypt to anywhere, we failed to build the institutional state, respecting the human rights for everyone. And there's lots of challenges that make this fail. But for now, we want to enhance this idea for the future, to build state, their institution, depending on the institution, respecting the human rights. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much, Yahya. Well, yeah, I mean, even we see it in Saudi Arabia, the orders, even in the judiciary, comes from the crown prince. So there are no institutions at all. And I think the first step to change the country is to build institutions. Maybe to end, because we don't have too much time, Yahya, do you have a positive note to end on?
the positive thing, it is not coming from the regime. I know there is a narrative around the world. They said, okay, if you criticize something, you need to say something positive. If we see something positive, we will say it. But we will not force ourselves to say something positive if there is no positivity. However, the positive thing, it's about our people, about the new generation. In the past, it was so difficult to change the people. The people at that time, they keep listening to the Wahhabism. They keep listening to them when they are telling people, yeah, you need to obey the order. If you don't obey the order, you will go to the hell. And everyone from the hell and worried from saying anything wrong to the ruler. At this moment, they sarcasm about the High Supreme for the fatwa, what they call the high fatwa religious group for the regime. They become like if they say something, people they take it like something funny, especially when someone, one of the most important people in the Wahhabism scholars, his name is Salih Al-Fawzan, and he appeared in fatwa, official fatwa in the Saudi TV, saying after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, he said the ruler allowed to kill anyone if he is not obeying the ruler. So he allowed them to kill anyone. People at this moment will not respect that at all. There is no divorce between Mohammed bin Salman and Wahhabism. They're still working for him, strongly working for him, and he's still alive with them. However, they can't work anymore like before because the new generation is more educated, and that's it. So we are optimistic about the new generation. The old material will not work. The old narrative, it will not work. The new generation is more educated, smarter. They can understand lots of things. So this is the challenge with the regime. And we have seen in the past, yes, I complain right now from our voices is not heard everywhere. However, if we compare, we are much, much better. And there is no way to compare. This change, yes, it is slow, but there is lots of change, especially with the new generation. They are optimistic. They understand what's going on. And we have seen that if someone become angry, they are not fighting each other like before. For people, when they become angry, it will become like ideological fight inside the country between liberal and Islamists, between Shia and Sunnah, between tribes and between everyone, because this is the game from the regime. At this moment, if someone become angry, he will become whether silent or criticize the regime. So it's not like before, and this is the thing that maybe we are optimistic about.
Thank you so much, Yahya. I think we're done for this panel. I just want to conclude by saying that, we have a lot of theory here, and it's important to name the people who are the first victims of the regime. So I just want to have a word for Salma Al-Shihab, Isra Al-Ghamgham, Lina Al-Sharif, Abdurrahman Al-Sadhan, Muhammad Al-Qahtani, Muhammad Al-Rabi'a, the Huwaitat tribes, and anyone who has been unjustly sanctioned in Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much. Of course, the father of Abdullah, I'm so sorry, is also in prison. We have so many people that it's so difficult to name them all. So I'm really sorry not to be able to list them. But thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah, Taha, Yahya. It was a very interesting panel, and thank you all for listening.
Josh? And welcome everyone to the second session of this annual conference. Okay. Give me a second, Josh. Sorry. Give me a second. شيل ايش بك هذا؟ شغل هنا. Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, Josh. Again, and welcome everyone to the second session of this annual conference, which follows the first session, which explored the repressive human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, which forms the core of this work. And in this session, we'll be zooming out somewhat to explore human rights across the wider Gulf region, especially through the lens of the World Cup, which is of course underway, and looking at human rights abuses which the tournament has brought to light and which has led to abuses as well, not least migrant worker rights, which is an endemic issue across the whole region. With me to discuss these issues and more is a panel of leading voices in the human rights community. Next to me on my left is Mustafa Qadri, founder and CEO of Equidem, a specialist
and labour rights organisation dedicated to defending human rights of vulnerable individuals around the world. To his left is Jawad Fayrouz, a Bahraini human rights defender, former MP, and director of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, a human rights NGO focusing on promoting human rights in the Gulf and Bahrain in particular. And apologies for Mariam El Khawaja, who is scheduled to speak and is unable to due to a clash on our side with the time difference. So she sends her apologies, but thanks so much, Jawad, for speaking here and at short notice as well. And joining us online is Nicholas McGeehan, the founding director of Fair Square Research and Projects, a human rights NGO focusing on migrant worker rights, on business and human rights, and authoritarianism. So we're delighted to have you all with us today. Thank you for being here. And thank you all for being here in the room as well. A reminder, there's a live stream on El Qis Twitter. And apologies, we don't have Arabic interpretation, but we'll be sharing some videos in Arabic after the conference. And so without further ado, let me hand the floor to the speakers who we're delighted to hear from. And we'll have a chance for some audience question and answer later on. So do think of some questions to ask the panel. I guess there's no place to start other than the Qatar World Cup currently underway. And let me maybe go to you first, Mustafa. Yourself and Equidem have been working on migrant worker rights in the Gulf, including in relation to Qatar in the lead up to the tournament for many years, carrying out groundbreaking research and advocacy. And as I understand, are the only human rights organization working on the ground itself in Qatar. So maybe as we gather here today with the World Cup underway, how do you assess the situation for migrant worker rights in the country?
Firstly, thank you, Josh, for inviting me to speak, and it's a real pleasure to speak to all of you. And I'm a really big fan of the work El Qis does on Saudi Arabia. It's needed work. It's very brave work. So it's really an honor to be speaking to you all. And also just to say, as a correction, of course, we're not the only human rights organization working in Qatar. There's a really impressive group of experts and worker-led presences there. But as Josh mentioned, what makes Equidem a little bit unique is all our research in Qatar is entirely independent, is carried out by migrant workers themselves, who are our staff, who are from Africa and Asia. So this gives us very unique insights into what is the situation there. And, very lucky to have Jawad and Nick also on this panel with their expertise. So obviously there's a range of issues to cover there. And you're perhaps familiar with the general situation with respect to labor rights in Qatar and with migrant workers. I thought given this particular forum, one thing that I could do could be quite useful is to give my own personal impressions that perhaps draw on not just what's happening for migrant workers and labor rights in Qatar, but from a wider civil rights, civil political rights framework. The work that I've done with my team now for about 10 years, it started in 2015 more significantly when I and one of my colleagues, Rameshwar, were actually arrested by Qatari authorities in Qatar, simply for going to a camp where there were about 300 workers, hadn't been paid for about 6 months. They were literally starving. And, despite our better instincts, we went into the camp because we were just so compelled to try to take down as many details as possible in the hope of, helping these workers. Now, this was a while back when I was a skinnier person and I was dressed like a migrant worker. And Rameshwar is himself from Nepal. My family is originally from the subcontinent, although I'm actually from Australia. But when we had that situation and the camp boss detained us and then we were taken to the police, for about 12 hours, we were treated like migrant workers. And so in no way is it in any way to say that we know what it's like to be migrant workers. We're not Gianni Infantino, if anyone saw that speech. But what has really struck me since that time to now and the work that we've done recently, we did 2 quite significant reports, roughly about 2,000 interviews in total with workers in the hotels and the stadium construction sites. It's not just the forced labor practices, which is basically work that is exacted out of someone, pushed out of someone on the threat of some kind of penalty, but it is the level of control and surveillance and fear, which I think will be very familiar to all of you, even if you're not familiar with the labor rights situation for migrant workers. And I would argue that this is based on now hindsight, the last sort of 10 years, is trying my best to draw back a little bit and try to understand what are we dealing with in this moment, is this real realization that these things are really interlinked. And so what I mean by that is that, number one, migrant workers in Qatar, as well as Saudi and in the Emirates and other countries, are actually seen as a national security issue, fundamentally, in part for demographic reasons, in part because the national security prism gives it a really good excuse to basically be unaccountable and use a hard hand and to securitize this issue. But the other reason is that beyond workers talking about not being paid, working in the heat, something Nick has done, really the incredible pioneering work on the risk of death from that, workers being charged illegal fees to just get a job, often thousands of dollars, so they're in debt bondage. What really came out from our interview is that I stress was done by other workers in private locations in a very intimate way, not in a survey style at all, very much a relationship building based interviews, was the level of fear workers felt just before making a complaint about the food, or when will their overtime payment come through, or whatever it might be. And so for me, what this has shown is that it's not just about labor reforms and audits and experts coming in, although those things can be important. It's about wider social reform. The other element that really comes out to me, which I think in a way has played out a little bit in some of the so-called backlash to the criticism of Qatar, which I personally intimately understand. I'm not from the Gulf. My family's from Pakistan and India. I was the Pakistan researcher for Amnesty International for a very long time, with my own family in Pakistan, who are actually very liberal-minded people, but being very pro the military. And I spent most of my time for about 7 years documenting the military and armed groups violations. So I actually understand this idea of, that it's all a plot or it's an attack on our society as not just, something which is empirically flawed, although it generally is, but I understand on a human level where that comes from. But I'd argue that in terms of labor rights and the migrant worker situation, it's also in its own way a reflection of what a Qatari goes through, or other, so-called privileged members of the Qatari society and arguably Khaliji society go through when they themselves have very limited, if no, social political rights. And that in the wider world context of labor rights and this idea around basically, human rights in the economy. So basically the democracy, the lack of democracy in the economy. It's a very common issue if it is very extreme in the Gulf, that those who are slightly higher up in the pecking order, but who are themselves in some way disenfranchised, they punch downwards. And I think that's also part of the story of what. And one thing I'd be really keen, because we have a really knowledgeable crowd here today on the panel, is to hear from all of you about, what are the next steps? Because for me, ultimately, I used to work in government. That was a very insightful experience for me in understanding some of the aspects of how governance works. When I joined the government, it was a year before America invaded Iraq, and the Australian government was very much in favor of that invasion. And Australia actually has very good international lawyers, and many of them are my friends. And so we had these discussions about advising the government on the legality of invading that country. And some of them would go and protest at lunchtime against their own government's policy. So why I mention that is the way in which, systems work that on paper are meant to help people and meant to keep things, but in reality go in a certain direction. So for Qatar, being the smallest of the big three Gulf states, that in my opinion, if I'm actually honest, I think they've been very successful. I think they've got away with everything and got worse. And I could talk a little bit about that if you want, with our teams on the ground, what they've been saying in the last few weeks. But, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And I don't have the answer, but a couple of things that come to mind, and I can perhaps end on this point, is, and I could be totally wrong, it's just really some views I've developed over the last sort of 10 years, is I think we have to shift more from a civil rights lens, not to sound like a Western liberal at all, but because what happens to workers, although it's different to what a Qatari national might go through, is part of the same picture. And even just in a pragmatic sense, the Khalij has to develop its, this will sound very boring at a human rights conference, but it has to develop its labor market. It has to develop gainful employment, because not just it's an economic thing, but it's how you kind of develop empowerment. It's not a perfect solution, because you look at a country like, say, Singapore, to an extent Hong Kong, where they have really, one of their strategies in those countries was to improve the level of employment of the nationals, but they're not very free societies. But my point is that what I've really noticed in Qatar and even the Emirates, where they have these elite universities, doesn't necessarily lead to a development of the intellectual life. It's not to say that people don't have an intellectual life. Space that is still very stifled. And in the same way, workers, simply for protesting, organizing, also get punished. It is something that we have to think about. Are there ways we can attack this in a way that's a bit subtle, while at the same time we do the more, overt strategies of calling out things when they're wrong? The second thing is climate change. Climate change is obviously hugely impacting the Gulf. It's increasing the temperatures. It's impacting everyone in the country. But also the Gulf is a huge contributor to climate change. Is that something that we grab onto? If the world is losing its concern for human rights in Qatar, in Saudi, or if the attempts that we're all making to try to change things aren't having an impact, but there is this concern about climate change, is that one of the areas of leverage that we push on? And then thirdly and finally, just to say, there is the need, practically speaking, to support rights holders, activists on the ground. And what does that look like? My organization works mostly on labor rights, but in the last number of years, we've also intermittently been in touch with members of the LGBTI community in Qatar, other people that you would describe as dissidents. And the thing that strikes me about what they face, having worked in lots of other contexts around the world, is, and I think it's different to Saudi as well, is just how atomized, how separated everyone is from trying to be able to organize So what does it look like to support people to organize and let them speak in their own terms, whether they're Qataris or they're workers? That's something that we're trying to look at. So there, yeah, again, I thought rather than going through a summary of the World Cup and the issues, I'm guessing that you're quite aware of what those are. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions about that. I thought that could be some areas for us to really think about, because, and not at all to be pessimistic, but to be honest with you, Qatar was meant to be the good example. It's a smaller country. It has a slightly third-way geopolitical strategy. There is access to Qatar. On the one hand, as someone who has spent time in Gaza and in the West Bank, I lived in the West Bank for about 6 months, about more than 10 years ago now. It was wonderful to see the Palestinian flag and the pro-Palestinian sentiments in Doha. It was wonderful, but at the same time knowing that simply wearing a rainbow wristband would get you kicked out of a stadium, or that workers that we were in touch with were still not getting paid, or women workers were facing quite serious discrimination. It really, really saddened me. So if Qatar was the best case scenario, where does that lead us? I think that's where I'm at the moment. So I'll leave it there. I can give it back to you, or I can go straight to Jawad, but I'd love to hear from you as well, and the other panelists as well, what your thoughts are.
Thanks so much, Mustafa, for your very interesting insight and framework, and building on rich personal experience and through your organization. I'll maybe now just go to Nick joining us online. And Nick, likewise, you and Fair Square have been investigating and advocating on migrant worker rights, including in the Gulf and Qatar, for many years. So maybe just to sort of give you the floor in light of Mustafa's comments and the World Cup underway now, how do you see things from your side?
You can't hear? Can you hear me now? Yeah? Okay. So what happened before the tournament was that there was this big avalanche of criticism of Qatar, both in the issue of migrant workers' rights and the LGBT plus issue. And since then, the game, the on-pitch drama has sort of taken over from the off-field controversy. So it's sort of hard on one level to step back from this media storm and everything that's happening and reflect on how successful or not this campaign on workers' rights has been. I think, I don't know how Mustafa feels about it, but I think in general there's a level of disappointment that we have not, or perhaps not, achieved what we set out to achieve. When Qatar won the right to host this in 2010, very little was known about Qatar. It was the least known, arguably, of the Gulf states, and all the migrant worker attention had been on the UAE, really, on Dubai and Abu Dhabi. But that suddenly shifted, and I think everybody saw that the spotlight of a World Cup provided an unbelievable opportunity to get Qatar to take the lead on issues because of the advocacy opportunities that a World Cup presents, and because of Qatar's need to look open and to continue to invite NGOs in and journalists to look around, essentially. They couldn't shut the country down and host this tournament. I think if you'd asked all of us when this started, would we have accepted the legal abolition of kafala and the abolition of the exit permit in Qatar? And we would have said yes, I think. And we got those things. But the problem is the kafala abolition came very late. It came in 2020, I believe. August 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a big problem with that, which, kafala abolition is a hugely ambitious thing to do. You're essentially saying we're going to get rid of this closed labour market and we're going to move to an open labour market. And it's not just a question of the stroke of a pen, right? You have to invest a tremendous amount of political capital in selling this to a national population that likes kafala. you know, if you, as Mustafa said, you know, this issue is seen as a national security problem. You know, 90% of the population is a culturally and linguistically distinct underclass. In order to loosen the shackles from these people, you have to sell that to businesses, and you have to sell that to a local population. Qatar did the first part, got rid of the law, but it did it very late, and it didn't do the second part. It hasn't done the second part, I don't think. So what we've seen is, you know, it's interesting. Lots of people say, oh, there are gaps in implementation and enforcement. It's a lot more serious than that. It's a lot more serious than that. It is that the necessary work required to give force to a law that changes the entire way in which a foreign workforce on which the entire country is based and is propped up. You just need a tremendous amount of effort to do that, and Qatar skimped on that. And I think very quickly after that legal reform went into place, it appears that a nod and a wink was given to the business community, which is to say, we need to keep this law on paper. We need to be able to tell the world that we have progressed and that we have used the World Cup to move forward. But actually, it's okay. You know, actually, if you want to get around this law, then there's all sorts of ways you can do it, and that's what we've seen. And it's relevant for the Saudi situation, you know, to bring it back to the work that you guys do, because Saudi Arabia will be watching this. They'll be watching how you host a tournament like that, signaling to the world that you've used it to transform your labor market, but actually doing something else entirely. And I think my great fear about Qatar 2022 is not that we didn't get the reforms that we wanted. I think I thought that a year ago. It is that Qatar has provided a blueprint for other, even arguably more, or not arguably, Saudi Arabia is a more repressive and a more abusive state, no doubt about it. That we have given them a blueprint for how to achieve 2030, and that concerns me. So I don't have an optimistic take on this. I'm very pleased on the one hand about the amount of awareness that has been shown on the issue. You know, this issue battles in the Gulf region with civil and political rights. You know, with these crucial cases that Al-Qassam works on, and we do a tiny bit of work on it as well. And I did some on Human Rights Watch. It's almost like the migrant worker issue has to battle for attention alongside that, which is understandable. And as someone who came into this issue, into the human rights field, really because I was interested in migrant workers' rights, I've been really pleased that everybody now knows about this issue and knows what kafala is and knows how damaging it is. But that, unfortunately, that second part, when you're a campaigner, which is, did we get what we wanted? Did we make, you know, did we change the system, and are we going to make people's lives better? I'm less optimistic about that. I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Nick, for that insight and that mixed picture which you've given. And I'm sure a lot more we can unpack further forward, including the blueprint you mentioned and with other countries watching on, and particularly relevant for Saudi Arabia as well, I think, who are due to announce bid for the 2030 World Cup, if I'm not mistaken, with Egypt and Greece. And as well as many things Mustafa mentioned, we can touch upon too, including climate change. And thinking of COP28 taking place in Dubai next year, which I'm sure will bring up lots of these things. But maybe just next to go to Jawad Ferouz. Thanks so much for joining, and maybe just to hear your thoughts on the comments so far, and of course in relation to Bahrain and the prevailing kafala system, which Nick mentioned, and with over 30 million migrant workers across the Gulf. So this is, of course, a wider regional issue.
Thank you very much. And it's not easy to speak in this topic after two specialists in this field, Mustafa and Nicholas. But let me start to thanking Al-Qist for allocating these important topics, which is related to Qatar. Why? Because as all of us knows that we've been accused as activists and many Gulfies, NGOs, that we've been supported by Qatar financially and so on. So good that we can indicate here, while we are criticizing the human rights violations in all GCC should be included Qatar. So it is, I think, give us a little bit more credibility that we want to be as high standard as we are to criticize the issues of related to the human rights violations. As introduction, let me mention this, that's whenever there is international events anywhere, it is going to be focused over the issue of the event itself, either it is economic, climate, business, politics, and so on. But for sure, there are two other things which is usually been linked on, we like it or not. Whitewash by particular authorities who are running the events. The whitewash is very, very highly been focused on and been invested a lot. Secondly, business. Thirdly, politics. All these three, all the concerns on try to utilize it on their best way. Unfortunately, the human rights issue is less being given attention to. So we are happy that during the World Cup, the issue of the human rights has been raised on by the case of the migrant workers. This is good indication. But I was a little bit surprised that only one part of the human rights violations in Qatar has been focused on. There are other types of many human rights violations been focused on. For example, the issue of revocation of nationality by many Qataris who are belonging to Ghofran tribe, for example. They've been banned from participating their basic political rights on the election, either nomination or voting and so on. And they are not just countable numbers, they are more than 5,000 and so on. I know there is big dispute, either they are having another nationality, Saudi nationality or so on, but there is issue that to be raised on. At the same time, we know that many individuals who practice their right maybe to criticize some certain types of the political authorities' actions, they've been jailed and so on. So that part has been hidden too. For sure, some other issues. So with regards to the migrant workers, I can guarantee that it is not the case in Qatar itself. The similar cases, we can see it in Saudi Arabia, maybe Bahrain, Kuwait, and so on. So one side, it is good, a very positive indication that the migrant workers' abuses is being raised, that to be considered a golden chance to provide their basic rights, not just in Qatar, to the rest of the GCC, to revise totally the kafala system, for example, or at least to be ensured that during this hot summer period timing, especially, there should be clear legislation and policy to don't involve them to any type of the work. For example, theoretically, Bahrain, they passed such legislation that from 12 noon till 2 p.m., they should be stopping of any work during any site, attending sites and so on. So the case, it is not just related to Qatar. So from one side, it was positive indication that's been raised, but it looks like later on, somehow it's being politicalized by the opponent of Qatari authorities because they don't want it to see any success by Qatar. So for sure, beginning momentum and beginning campaign was pure humanitarian wise, which it was positively, and I think we already back that one, and we hope that it will end up on a very concrete result, not just during the COP itself, not to be forgotten. It should be continuous campaign to get changes in the legislations, on the changes in the policies. There should be amendment to guarantee entire rights of not just migrant workers. Just migrant workers are a small sample. For example, housemaid. We can see that the housemaid are suffering the same way are the migrant workers are suffering in the Gulf. For example, housemaid, they don't have any leave per week. They do entire housework without any type of the mercy and so on. Many of them, for example, is not being paid on regular basis. Many of them have been sexually abused, for example. So their suffering, I believe, is not less than the migrant worker during this construction or reconstruction of Qatar and so on. So, but that has not been much been emphasized. I believe that we have to take such opportunities. Any international events going on in any country, and part of it, the GCC, we have to focus over the issue of the human rights. As Joshua mentioned, and my colleague mentioned, that next year we have COP28 on the climate in Dubai. So it is golden chance for us to coordinate and plan in advance what are the issue of the human rights violations there in UAE, to bring it up to the international community and try to magnify it and as way as possible. Another part and another angle of the discussion here is that there should be changes on the regulations of those who are organizing this type of the events. For example, FIFA. Now, next COP, where going to be? And is it the similar mistakes of the abuses which has happened to the, for example, migrant workers in Qatar would be repeated itself? As the time comes that there should be certain standards and measures and certain types of the, let me say, limits that we can measure it up before we agree on what country such activities to go on. This is that we raised it a long time back, even during the Formula One, for example, in Bahrain. We indicated that it is not just pure sport. As I indicated, it will be misused for the whitewash. It will be misused for any types to hide in all these grave human rights violations and so on. So we should carry on a larger campaign, not through the hosting countries. We have to carry it on over that one who are organizing such international events and demanded that issue of the human rights to be part of the standards of when you are deciding to where to have such international events. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jawad, for that insight, and yeah, a lot of overlap and things to unpack as well, and including on the limited nature of the reforms to the kafala system, which is also relevant in Saudi Arabia, which last year announced some reforms to the kafala system, but excluded significantly domestic workers who make up a large number of them. Maybe just to ask one or two follow-up questions to the panelists and then allow plenty of time for question and answer from the audience. So do you think of some questions yourselves? Maybe on the topic of looking forward. So we've obviously talked about Qatar and some of the reforms taking place, which and the limitations of them. I guess looking forwards and towards other sporting and international events such as COP28 in Dubai and the announcement I mentioned of Saudi Arabia and Egypt possibly bidding for the World Cup. Maybe what are some of the lessons learned? So yeah, go to you, Nick. Maybe how could we respond to these types of events in terms of calls around whether to boycott or not, or to use these events to push for reforms or not? Maybe in terms of the lessons learned from Qatar and the blueprint that we have from this sort of spotlight.
Right. Very good question. Maybe I'll take the Saudi Arabia Egypt World Cup angle, just because I'm more tuned into that than I would be the sort of the debates around the climate movement and the dynamics around the climate movement. I mean, it's very interesting to look at the pushback, right, from Qatar. Now we know that this is a state that has a very well financed public relations operation, right? We know that they were very stung by a lot of the criticism, and the pushback that came back was well, it's largely it's racism, it's Orientalism. We're only being criticized because it's the first World Cup in an Arab Muslim country, and that argument, I think, there's very little evidence, to be honest, in the discourse for it, or certainly no evidence that the criticism was disproportionate or unfair. But I think it was very cleverly weaponized by the Qataris. And I think one of the lessons we can learn for Saudi Arabia and Egypt is that's what they will be trying to do. They will look at what happened, they will look at the defense that Qatar proposed, and they will try to do the same thing. I don't know if any of you saw today, but there was a proposal that apparently, fronted by the Qatari authorities that teams at the World Cup should wear an armband saying no to Islamophobia, which was a direct, response, I think, to some of the armbands that some of the European teams were trying to wear. But it was very interesting. And then the other thing I think we have to be aware of, I mean, there was a very interesting story today. It's just broken in Brussels, actually, which is that the new head of the International Trade Union Confederation has been arrested on corruption charges in relation to a probe from the Belgian authorities looking at Qatari finance being thrown around Brussels. It's just broken in the last couple of hours. It'd be very interesting to see what the fallout from that is. And it would be injudicious of me to say too much about what I think about that. But it is significant. And I think what Qatar did very well, and again, it helps if you have a lot of money, or if you can offer organizations whatever it is that they are looking to get out of a situation, and often it's things like impact. But if you can offer organizations like that, things like that, things that they need and want, then you can co-opt influential, incredible organizations into your public relations campaign. And I think one of the big lessons learned for me in having done this work for about 10 years is watching how that happened, and watching how people who you had supposed were allies in your in a shared campaign suddenly sort of drifted away and actually became a significant part of the pushback from Qatar. So again, I don't feel so well placed to comment on COP. There'll be a lot of interesting debates about that. Do people go or do they not go? I mean, I know from the Egypt, what little I know about the Egypt situation, I know that there were some within the Egyptian rights community that wanted that COP27 to be there. So they wanted the spotlight. They wanted to talk to the media. Maybe others were more in favour of a boycott, and I'm not sure how that's going to play out in the UAE. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes, I guess. Okay, I'll stop rambling there.
Thanks a lot, Nick, and that's very interesting, and overlaps too with some comments say that Naphan talked at the start of the conference in terms of the discourse around the World Cup and the noise around that. But I mean, as human rights groups working on these issues for years, I mean, it's possible to condemn some of the problematic aspects of discourse, and then but not let it put you off on the important human rights work. Maybe to come to you, Mustafa, in light of that, and maybe thinking sort of next steps and upcoming events like COP28, and what lessons have we learned from the Qatar World Cup?
Yeah, no, it's the $1 trillion question. I mean, I try to think about it in the most sort of pragmatic way possible. And as the other speakers have mentioned, we have the one advantage of having seen how things played out with Qatar. Here's a couple of things I'd think of. One is building a local constituency. So obviously, we work mostly with workers, but also with Khalijis, people from these communities. Al-Quds does this already, right? But what does that look like? Because with the Qatar situation, one thing that had a huge advantage in the direction is no Qatari or no locally based person is going to come out and criticize the regime. So they kind of had a blank slate there to to come out and condemn these things. With the Islamophobia thing, which is very effective. Well, what has the Gulf states' position been towards China with what is clearly at least crimes against humanity, if not genocide of Muslims in Xinjiang? Look at the so-called Muslim states in the world. They've all been very quiet. All of them, Pakistan, the Gulf states, the others that are majority Muslim states. There's a few exceptions, I think, in Asia. But the point is that those things can be called out, but there needs to be some ownership of the messaging from the communities that are basically being condemned, so that it can't be, I think, it's not a criticism, but it does sometimes appear like a very global north dominated discussion, which obviously it will always be, because number one, the global north is dominant, But also, and I think it's a very honest point to make, is the global north still remains, for all its significant flaws, which are getting worse, one of the most free spaces to speak about things. So that there is a pragmatic reason for it too. But I think that's one thing, is ownership. The second thing I'd say is that there's a lot to this, but I try to zoom out as much as I can and think about this in terms of the broader global movement for democracy and human rights, like the genuine democracy and human rights, that no one owns that. And it's owned by Chinese protesters, however they view it, as protesting against lockdowns, as Saudis and Khalijis protesting however they do it, and of course people in established democracies. But if you think about with Qatar's ability and the Gulf states' ability to basically buy the acquiescence, what's underneath that? And I'm going to be a bit out there at the moment. It's neoliberalism. So neoliberalism has weakened liberal democracy, and not just in the West. In India, India's democracy now, Turkey's democracy, Indonesia's going in that direction, Malaysia. It's not the only factor. The world's complicated, but it is wealth concentration that favors systems of control. And I often used to go to Qatar in the way that I used to go to South Asian countries for my work. And, you'd meet with government officials and influential politicians. And often after meetings, I'd feel like a total patsy, because I think in my head, these people that I'm talking about human rights, they're probably going and having social events in New York and Brussels and London with the elites of the countries that we're from, and where they stitch things up between themselves. Now, of course, the world's more complicated than that. But all I'm saying is, how do we deal with this? Is it can't just be a strategy that's about the Gulf, although, of course, we need to be focusing specific aspects of what we do on what's happening in Saudi and other countries. I'm not ignoring that. But we have to think of a holistic strategy. So that number one, it does deal with this issue around looking like there's a double standard. But number two is, we know that liberal democracies, where there is improvement in democracy, will by definition, although of course it will require lots of work, because human rights work always needs work, it doesn't just happen. That's how power works. It increases the chance that those governments and those powers, centers of power in those countries, will then criticize Saudi Arabia. You saw with the Biden administration initially, it was actually, by American standards, actually quite good on Saudi initially, before the Ukraine crisis, and it's the lack of popularity of Biden as a leader and other factors. So I think that's also part of it too. You have to think about, the power analysis, what are the levers there? And finally, I'd say is targeting the human dimension as much as possible, which I think on Saudi, in fact, we're quite advanced compared to, say, Qatar, a country that people don't really know. But Saudi, it's well known that there is such a significant amount of restriction in human rights that on a human level, people just think that's not right. And it is about supporting Al-Qasd and similar organizations who are from the region in different ways, because many people cannot come out publicly. It's too risky to say, look, we have to give you ownership, but we also have to use language that's universal. There's not always human rights language. It can be language around, if you do a job, you get paid for it. If the heat's going to kill you, don't put you in the heat. If you're a woman, get paid the same, get treated the same. I know it sounds very simplistic, but what I'm trying to say is building the constituency. I think, and it's not a criticism at all of our human rights movement. I'm very proud to be part of it, but, it can be a very lonely existence working in human rights. But one of the paradoxes of that is that we can sometimes be a little bit too much, for very good reason, speaking too much to our own very diverse and very big community, but finding those ways to reach out to others. And I think that is one positive, although there are actually quite a few that have come out of Qatar, which is we've been reaching people that generally don't really care about human rights. They care about sport and that sort of thing. And like I said, with this bittersweet thing of seeing the Palestinian flag and the kafir in Doha, while at the same time knowing it's very cynical, it's trying to find those spaces, knowing that, it's with human rights work, it's never, ever really, very rarely are there moments when there's a slam dunk. I think in my lifetime, there's only been, which is, now in my 5th decade, there's only been 3 really. I can think of maybe 4. which is the end of the Soviet Union, end of apartheid, and the creation of East Timor in Indonesia, from Indonesia, where things happened that we did not expect. So it's always a struggle. It's a challenge, but there are always solutions out there. There are always solutions out there, but you've got to have ownership. You've got to look at what works, and thinking outside the box as much as possible is really, really key.
Cheers, Mustafa, and that's a nice hopeful note as well. And maybe now we could chat for hours, but we've got about 10-15 minutes to go of this session. Maybe it's a good time to open up to the floor, given how much we've sort of unpacked here. Be good to hear of any questions from the audience, if there are any.
I just want to follow up on a couple of points. One is the I think a very important point Mustafa made, and Jawad also reinforced that migrants are perceived as a national security risk, and I think the security issue is very important. The other thing I wanted to ask Nick about specifically, and it's very interesting about this latest development you've just told us about in Belgium, but when you look at an organization like the ILO, which was admirably placed to push through and to continue to pressure the Qataris to deliver, and you made a very good point that it's in the legislation, but there's been a nudge and a wink. What do you have to say about those kinds of Western institutions that basically, from my perspective, got rolled into the World Cup bandwagon and a kind of accepted the Qatari government line? Thanks.
Thanks for that, Bill. Yeah, I mean the ILO was in this very interesting situation, right? It had a lot of leverage back in 2018, 2017, when basically the Gulf crisis happened and Qatar was reaching out for friends and allies. And I remember we had this conversation, and I'm sure most have had the same ones, when we said, to the ILO then, you have leverage, so make sure that there is a precondition. If you sign a technical assistance agreement, get some sign of good faith before you do that. So ask Qatar to abolish its exit visa system, for example. Don't just go in and accept promises and pledges. I remember being very, very disappointed, and I don't think I was the only one when they said they were just going to go on pledges and promises from the Qataris. And what happened as soon as they did that was the dynamic completely changed. The ILO went from being the organization that was a huge threat to Qatar, which could not host a World Cup while a commission of inquiry into forced labor was ongoing, to being an organization that was essentially taking money to do a technical assistance program and had an office in the country. And that entirely changed the dynamics. And they were then placed in a situation where they had to deliver that reform process on behalf of the Qataris, while answering questions from NGOs and from the international media on it. And I think what the Qataris have always been excellent at is making sure that their talking points and their narrative is rammed down the ears, I guess, not the throat of allies. And the line is always, don't criticize, because if you criticize, we're the reformers, right? We're the reformers in this country. And if you criticize, then you don't help us. And the hardline guys will say that nobody's ever happy and the whole thing will fall apart. And it's a standard line, Bill, I'm sure you've heard it, right? It's a standard line you hear from the Gulf states. Don't criticize us, because if you criticize us, it's the pro-reform guys. It's us. It's you hear it in Bahrain, you hear it in Saudi. There's always the great reformer who we are supposed to cosset and support. And part of that is supposed to be silence. I think that what the ILO is trying to do and achieve is, as I said, hugely ambitious. We have had a few disagreements, a few open disagreements with them about the manner in which they've phrased certain things. I would say that, yeah, there are certain situations where I think they should have been more robust in standing up to the Qataris and pushing them a bit harder. We would like to have seen that for sure. The thing that concerns me, I think, was I don't know if you saw the recent statements from the new Director General of the ILO last week, when he said something to the effect that the ILO and FIFA could get into some sort of arrangement where the ILO would do due diligence for FIFA for future bids. That sort of concerns me, given that I don't think the ILO has necessarily been successful in delivering the technical assistance program and the key reforms in Qatar, that they have an eye on doing this again. So I'm not sure I've answered your question as directly as you might have liked, but it's been a very interesting situation to watch unfold, and I think people will be studying it for time to come and commenting on it for time to come.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Bill, for the question. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I can maybe ask another follow-up question. Maybe, Joao, do you have a response to what we've heard? Mm-hmm.
I believe that whatever our position or stand going to be should be constructive and not destructive, in a way that's there are room for win-win. For example, Qatar authorities can win, can have the cup, and should have our own standards towards protecting human rights in the same way. This is impossible? No, it's not impossible. I think one of the lessons we got from the Qatar that it could happen. For sure, during the preparation, Qataris needed so much support, and they are ready to, let me say, apply whatever certain types of the recommendations or demands were from the international community. So it was a chance for us. All the time, I believe in such opportunities, we should take it as a chance. Here I can bring up, for example, the latest visit of Pope in Bahrain. Boycotting or demanding to don't visit, it is not a solution. Why? Because already certain engagement been there. So if you go through your campaign to demand a boycott or demand to don't visit, it will not end up in the good results. What we done, we try to utilize it as an opportunity to be engaged with the Pope and try to deliver to him or whatever you want to say to the international community through the Pope. And this is what he done. And this is what been successful of our campaign. In his first opening speech, he delivered the majority of our demands of improving human rights violations in Bahrain, for example, which was success for us. And similar way, any other, for example, next year, they're going to be IPU General Assembly in Bahrain, International Parliamentary Union General Assembly going to be in Bahrain from 11th till 15th of March. So for us, I think there's going to be opportunity for sure. We cannot ban it. We cannot ask them to don't go there. We cannot cancel it, but this is going to be opportunity for us to try deliver issue to the all type of the human rights, all types of the political rights, all types of the civil rights to be delivered by the parliamentarian while they are there in the land in Bahrain. So I believe that sometimes there is win-win case. In this regard, especially related to Qatar, I can say that we should seek the change through the dialogue. We should find a way. It is not all the time total confrontation. There are certain types of the dialogue, and this is, I think, somehow in Qatar worked through the dialogue, contact, putting more pressure, and then they have to observe it. Then rectify the shortages, human rights issue, civil rights, more empowering women, for example, or all the issues that we are looking for. There's a chance that we should focus on that. During these events internationally, they are under the focus. So for sure, we're going to take the attention of the media, we're going to take attention of the politicians, we can take attention of the parliamentarian, policymakers, activists, and so on. Then we can make certain changes by focusing on that country, bringing up, and then trying to put more pressure through that shortages that to be rectified.
So we're nearing towards the end of the session. I think we've just got a couple more minutes. So do put your hand up and let us know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will hear final thoughts from our panelists.
Oh, I just first, maybe well, if you have any question, I can just say something really quickly. Because it's, with what Jawad said, I totally agree in principle. Like, I think that doesn't have to be confrontation at all. And I totally agree with you. One thing I think I've learned now with the work that we've done, it's not something that I think I knew initially, is, so one of the challenges is in the Khalij is the reform is going to be top-down. Problem with top-down reform, separate to why it's done and whether it's actually genuine, is real reform has to be organic, has to be social. So for example, obviously we saw how the Arab Spring ended up. We see how what's happening with Iran. We know that as much as how widespread the support is and how inspiring it was, just even the soccer players, the footballers coming out, that the regime is very strong. It's very brutal. But I think for me, the question that's linked to what Jawad, brother Jawad said, is that how do we build local ownership? Doesn't mean that it's some magical solution. I'm not, because again, there's repression there, but we have to have a strategy ultimately that where the people of that region, whether it is Khalijis or the migrant workers, they're in charge, to be simplistic, and that the rest of us support. And that part of that is then the spectrum of, in any plural system, any system, I mean democratic, not in that formal sense that the State Department talks about. I mean like in a purely human sense. People have different perspectives, have different strategies. They can often be very different. That's fine. But the objective is one, which is we're all the same. We all have our rights respected. You don't get to go to jail. You don't go to jail just for saying something. You don't get treated differently because of your gender, your sexuality, or whatever. But that's the objective. And so, number one, there has to be, I think personally, very strongly, finding strategies, even if right now it's not possible, but in the long term, how does the local community own the movement? And number two is, that second point that I made. And yeah, linking it to the wider sort of human rights issues that people are facing. One thing that we've learned with the work that we did on Qatar, and this is just a final point, is to make it as 360 as possible, is one of the other challenges when it came to migrant workers was that the elites in the countries where workers come from are themselves completely complicit in what's happening. And that has to do with politics and economics. So that, for example, one of my colleagues, Joffrey, is himself from Kenya, an amazing labor organizer, was rescuing domestic workers in Qatar over the last 4 years, got under the radar of the Qatari authorities because of that work. He wasn't agitating, he wasn't protesting, he was literally using their existing labor reform system. And then they basically deported him in a very bad way. When our report came out, we initially were not going to have him publicly as one of the speakers because the Kenyan election was happening. And what he and our Kenya team explained to us is the Kenyan elite also run the recruitment industry. So if in any way we talk about companies that they're recruiting for, they could literally be risk to their life. So I think that's another thing that we really need to talk about, which is that how do you have that interplay of where there are spaces like London where we can speak freely, where we know that we're speaking on behalf of others, to have that sense of humility about, we're carrying it for them, but also that there is that aspect to it as well, that how do we deal with these different aspects? And I think, again, there are solutions. There are solutions out there. So, it's tough, but, stay positive. There are things that we can do, but it's a battle. It never keeps stopping.
Thanks again, Mustafa. Maybe on that hopeful note again, we will draw this session to a close as we're just approaching the hour. And I'd like to take the chance to thank you all again, Mustafa, Jawad, and Nick, for your excellent insight and unpacking this broad issue and the many calls to action that we've discussed, and causes for optimism as well, that I think gives us a lot of food for thought, including going into the next and final session, which will look at the wider geopolitical environment impacting human rights in the region. So thank you all. Hope you stick around. We'll have a couple of minutes break, but probably not the full 15 minutes, and then we'll go into the last session shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, everyone. Welcome to the third panel discussion of today, where we'll be speaking about human rights in the changing geopolitical environment. And the environment in which we are operating and defending and promoting human rights has really drastically changed over the past year. On the one hand, we have seen the steady rehabilitation of Mohammed bin Salman to the global stage. 4 years after the gruesome murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, for which unfortunately we have not seen a lot of accountability until today, despite clear information that the Saudi crown prince ordered this killing and was involved in it. On the other hand, we're also seeing the war in Ukraine that has caused a global energy crisis and further strengthened the position of countries like Saudi Arabia, being one of the countries with the largest oil reserves. And I think from our perspective, working in the field of human rights, we've really seen that it's been increasingly difficult to rally the support of politicians to increase the pressure on the Saudi authorities, especially now that they need them more than ever. But the question is, what do we do about this, and how do we make sure that we can still advance human rights in the region? Do we need new allies? Do we need a new approach? I think this session is really here to collect tips and recommendations of how to successfully operate in this new geopolitical environment. And I'm really pleased to be joined by 3 expert speakers. A quick hello to Ines Osman and Salma Al-Husseini online. I'll be coming to you in a second, but I'll be starting off with Bill Law here in the room. It's great to have you. Bill is an award-winning journalist, and he's been extensively reporting from the region. He's also an analyst and focuses on issues in his blog, The Gulf Matters. So it's great to have you with us, and maybe you can sort of set the stage for this discussion, trying to elaborate a little bit on how the situation has changed, what are the challenges we're facing today, and maybe already if you have some suggestions of how we can maneuver this changed environment.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks to Al-Qis for inviting me. I think it's a very important time, and also the work that Al-Qis is doing is absolutely crucial. And so I applaud you and Yahya and all the others that are working at Al-Qis for the really superb and very difficult work that you're doing. You spoke about the context. I think context, as my old boss at BBC used to say, is everything. And the context is that you're quite right. The war in Ukraine has changed things, but actually it's been changing for some time. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize or try and understand what is going on, particularly in the Gulf, but in the wider Middle East. What the new generation of leaders is saying, particularly to the Americans and to us, is that we're a new breed. We're not going to respond the way the old generation did. So that in the old days, when America said, turn on the taps, give us a little more oil ahead of a midterm or ahead of a presidential election, the response was, okay, we'll do it. Well, we know what happened when Mr. Macron or Johnson or indeed Joe Biden went to Mohammed bin Salman and said, will you please turn on the taps? He just said, la, forget it. No, I'm not doing it. And this to me represents this, as I say, this new breed. What is it made of? Well, first of all, I think there's this real new nationalism afoot, which is driving these, younger leaders. I mean, we look at, I'll talk a little later about who I consider to be the 3 major leaders, but these younger leaders, and it is empowering them, but also it's empowering people in the region. They're getting a different signal from their leaders. They're responding differently to how they look at the West, how they look at not just our leaders, but Western media. We've seen that in the reaction to the World Cup in Qatar. The second element is the decline of U.S. power, which has been going on for a long time. We must recognize that. And clearly, the invasion of Iraq was a huge turning point, a defining moment. America, however, has been withdrawing subsequently. If you look at the presidency of Obama, Obama was obsessed with the deal with Iran. Otherwise, he basically ignored the Middle East. Trump was obsessed with Trump and obsessed with selling weapons. So he's kind of a throwback. What you do is, we give you cover, which you did for the murder of Jamal, and you buy our weapons. And then we come to Biden, and Biden said when he was campaigning, "I'll turn MBS into a pariah." Well, we know where that went, not very far. And U.S. Power is not just declining on the world stage; it's declining diplomatically in the Middle East. And one of the things that Trump did was absolutely decimated the Middle East State Department of some very talented people. The Arab Spring was mentioned. One of the things that happened with the Arab Spring was the authoritarian monarchs and rulers were able to crush, while we in the West stood by and let it happen, the revolutions in Egypt, in Libya. We see what's happening in Tunisia, and that gave them a sense of entitlement that they'd been able to stand up to what they saw as a significant threat that could potentially, and we know, got as far as Bahrain. In their eyes, this is this wave coming in. So that also gave them this sense of empowerment. And then, as you mentioned, the Arab Spring, which I think really put the wind in the sails, but the sails are already up and flourishing. And this war, which has decimated the people of Ukraine and has produced a real quandary in the West about how we deal with it, how far we can go. Well, if you look at what the Gulf has said, they pretend to say, "Oh no, we're kind of sitting on the fence." Yeah, we're not going to overtly support what Putin is doing, but we're not going to come out and apply sanctions, for example. Forget about the sanctions. And in fact, Dubai hung out the welcome banner to the kleptocrats. Come on in, bring your money. We'll put it in our banks. Come on in, bring your super yachts. You can park them in the harbor, and everything's going to be okay. And what we've seen recently is that the Saudis and the Emiratis have responded to Putin, by not putting in sanctions. I mean, there are even suggestions that the Saudis have been buying oil from Russia and then putting it out on the world market. Now, this is a claim made by an MEP last week. I don't know the substance of it, but it's an interesting thought. And so what we've seen is that these authoritarian regimes saying we're sitting on the fence, but actually, in my mind, they've already crossed to the other side, and they are, although overtly professing a neutral position, they're actually supporting quite dramatically the Russians, because every time they want to hold the price of oil at least at 80. It's about 85 now. They'd be very happy with 100. That money that Putin gets as well goes into the war effort and the destruction of Ukraine. And of course, there is already this tilt towards Asia. The Americans have been talking about, we got to get to China, we got to figure out China. Well, this has been going on for some time. You get these huge deals now going on between the Saudis and the Chinese. You get all these opportunities that are being created by this removal of this bipolar world. And the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris are playing it well. And so we're seeing that shift. So, that's the kind of context. And that means that if you're, and you touched on it, Julia, if you're in this new world as a politician, then your priorities are going to be trade, and particularly acute for us with Brexit, in my mind, insanity of Brexit. It's going to be, selling the weapons. It's going to be maintaining, and you look at the Gulf, they say it's a stable region. Everywhere around is unstable. Stability, security, all those messages resonate much more strongly now because of this new context that we're living in. And so it becomes that much more difficult for human rights organizations to break through. And I know that anybody, all of the people, and I'm looking at some of you now, thinking of the enormous courage and tenacity with which you pursue the battle. And I think you're all warriors in this terrifically difficult struggle. It's become very much harder. And Miriam Alawaja was telling me on one of my podcasts, she said, Bill, it's just becoming really, really hard because we sense we're not making that progress and we're getting burnt out. We are getting burnt out, and I'm sure you all feel that. And you know, what are the answers? Now, all right, let's look at the leaders. These individuals, and I think each one of them is very interesting in their own way. If you look at Mohammed bin Zayed, he plays a long game. He's very cool. He's always preferred to be in the shadows. If you look at how he played the Yemen war, he let Mohammed bin Salman come out and say, "This war, I can deal with it in 2-3 weeks. Done and dusted. We'll be out of there." And you know, that war is 8 years on. People of Yemen have been decimated. The Emiratis have pretty much got what they wanted out of that war. You know, they've got Qatar. They you know, control Aden. They basically, without it being proclaimed, have got almost a client state in South Yemen. What has Mohammed bin Salman got? He's got a mess because the Houthis are, you know, got him almost up against a wall, and he wants to get out. He can't figure out a way out. But that speaks to Mohammed bin Salman, who is rash, unstable. Some would say a mad visionary. I mean, if he sort of carries through, on his plans to transform the Saudi economy, right? And he's spending hundreds to get the trillions on this vision, then yeah, he will have changed Saudi society. But of course, in the process of doing that, he is being absolutely viciously repressive. And then we come to Tamim. Tamim, his dad said, "Okay, son, you take over. I got you the World Cup. Now it's your turn." And you know, if you go back and Nick mentioned it, 2017, that was when the Saudis, the Emiratis, basically launched this blockade of Qatar, and it was led by the Emiratis, and Abu Dhabi were the charging force. The Bahrainis and the Egyptians got pulled in. Why? Because the Emiratis and the Saudis are keeping their economies afloat. So we have, again, a situation where Tamim, I think, has played the cards very well. He got the World Cup, as we've discussed. The World Cup has done an extraordinary thing. When you think about it, Qatar is this tiny little state that virtually people in the world, if they know anything about, what do they know? Very little. Unless you're familiar with the region. What, an indigenous population of 300,000 people. And now everyone in the world knows what Qatar is. So you know, the Emiratis and the Saudis are looking at this going, So there was Sheikh Mohammed from Dubai going with his son, the Crown Prince, almost to pay obeisance to the World Cup and Sheikh Tamim. There was MBS going to Doha, you know, for the opening. Extraordinary sort of flip from where the Qataris have been in 2017. And so, you know, that again is I think a measure of, you know, these leaders and how they played. And I think it's important that we not treat them all as sort of a monoblock of authoritarians. Each one has particular strategies, particular stratagems, particular strengths, particular weaknesses. So where does this leave us with the human rights situation? I think very, very difficult. It's not a terrific picture by any means. And I want to, you know, mention some names, and they're just representative of the thousands of people and the families that have been suffered so much and paid such a high price. Lejane El Hathlul, my sister Lena is here. Extraordinary courage of Lejane, of her family, and I pay tribute to you, Lena, and to your family. Salman Al-Uda, what was his sin? He was a moderate clergy who had 14,000 Twitter followers. That was enough for MBS to throw him in jail. He's been in prison in appalling circumstances for 5 or 6 years. And Abdul Rahman Al-Sadan. Again, I had the honor to speak with Arij, and she's again done extraordinary work. And you look at what's going on here. Mohammed bin Salman executed 81 people in a single day. The silence from our governments is just appalling, and we are appalled. But it seems like the wider world no longer is appalled or no longer seems to care. And in UAE, Ahmed Mansour, who I'm proud to say is a friend, in appalling circumstances, in solitary confinement. Nasser bin Ayat, a distinguished economist and analyst. Mohammed Al-Rokan, a lawyer, these people are suffering, their families are suffering. And in Bahrain, Abdul Hadi Al Awaja, Nabil Rajab, Nabil is out. Again, a very good friend of mine. But he's basically in prison. He can't say anything. And Sheikh Ali Salman, who leader of Al Wafaq, the banned political party. Let me just finish on this note. I wanted to speak about women's rights. I think that's very important. And I think perhaps that's one of the solutions we can look at later on. But I did want to, because I realize I'm taking a lot of the time here. I interviewed Dalali Rakat, who is a Palestinian academic in Ramallah. And she said something to me, because I said, how can you, the Palestinian situation is appalling and it gets worse day by day. And again, the silence is really shocking and appalling from our governments. And I said, how do you maintain hope? And so she said this: I think I cannot justify the rationality of being hopeful. However, resilience is our only way out. And being hopeful is the only thing that I have to carry on, just to find ways out of the status quo. And I think, the resilience, I pay huge tribute to the resilience of the Palestinian people, to the resilience of the people that have been imprisoned and jailed, to their families. And I think in that resilience, because, I just simply believe to the core of my being that freedom cannot be suppressed forever. I just believe that. It services and it challenges the dictators. How it plays out is going to take a long time, but I think that we are in a new stage now, Julia, and it presents new challenges. And we need to, I think, devise, as a journalist, I need to, human rights activists need to, because the battle goes on. La lutte continue. La lutte continue. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you, first of all, for setting the stage of what's happening geopolitically in the Gulf, but also for actually mentioning individual human rights defenders whose names can't be mentioned often enough. And also for kind of touching upon the fact that obviously we're operating in a very restrictive environment at the moment. And yeah, people are burning out over this and it is challenging. But it is also because it is so repressive, it's now more important than ever to continue the day-to-day struggle and to find new ways of having impact. And I think in the panel that we just saw before, there were already a few ideas I think I picked up on obviously wider cooperation amongst different groups, spreading across the region and different countries that could help. Maybe we can also look into trying to find new allies. I think it was Mustafa Qadri who said, well, the sort of climate crisis is happening while we're talking about the human rights. So, if we could maybe join forces, that would be a way to confront or kill two flies with one stone, or try to at least strengthen our movement. But with that being said, I would like to turn now to Ines Osman. Ines is a human rights lawyer. She's the founder and director of Geneva-based legal advocacy NGO MENA Rights Group. And I think, Ines, before we maybe turn to the solutions, would like to also touch upon another worrisome trend that we're seeing while we also see, an increasingly difficult geopolitical environment, and that is transnational repression. So maybe I'll turn it to you. You could share with us a little bit about sort of your experience as a human rights practitioner and elaborate on that trend. And yeah, if you already want to share some ways out, some solutions, feel free to do that too, or we'll come to that in the question session after.
Thank you so much, Julia. Can you hear me fine? Yes, perfect. Thank you for having me today. I'm really pleased to see you all and discuss and brainstorm about these very important topics. Bill mentioned China and Saudi. As everybody knows, the Chinese leader is now in Saudi. I think first visit in 7 years, and these alliances are also causes for concerns from the perspective of human rights NGOs. We've seen, for example, the arrest, disappearances, and sometimes forcible return, for example, of Uyghurs that were in Saudi Arabia, either living in Saudi or, that traveled to Saudi for the pilgrimage, that were arrested, based on the request of China in Saudi. And we're currently following up on the situation of 2 individuals who are actually disappeared or secretly detained in Saudi prisons, 2 Uyghurs, and who are at risk of being sent back to China. And of course, seeing these alliances kind of reinforced is really a cause for concern. On another topic, I just wanted to bring up the recent case of Sharif Othman, who is an Egyptian political commentator. He has a YouTube channel on which he criticizes the regime, the president. He's also a former army officer. And he was traveling to Dubai last month and was arrested based on a warrant sent by Egypt to the UAE. And while initially the family, and I have to say that he's also a US national, and the US, it was the understanding of the US consulate that it was on the basis of an Interpol warrant, which was also an extra cause for concern, because as some of you might know, Interpol is now presided by Emirati Minister of Interior Raisi, but actually it turns out that it was not even an Interpol red notice, but a warrant actually sent through the Arab Ministers Council. Some people refer to it as the Arab Interpol. And of course, the UAE and Egypt are very, very close allies, but this makes it also extra difficult for civil society organizations, because when people are subject to red notice by Interpol, like, there are ways to access your file, to request the deletion of your file, and there are sort of things that we NGOs can do for these individuals. But with this sort of Arab Interpol, there is zero transparency. There is, of course, zero way for these individuals to kind of appeal and get delisted. So it's extremely worrisome to kind of see these developments. And I also want to pick up on what Bill was mentioning regarding, the sort of weakening of U.S. diplomacy. I think recent cases of, in this case, he's a U.S. national. I believe that his fiance is a little bit disappointed at the, let's say, lack of a very strong position, or like very strong, request for his release, because he's clearly, at risk of torture and prolonged arbitrary detention if he's sent back to Egypt. But in Saudi Arabia, we've seen recently some other cases. I'm thinking of Mr. Al-Mahdi, who is a US national and was recently sentenced to 16 years in prison for tweets that are not even, very controversial. But and US diplomacy has not been very strong. And we just keep on hearing from families that they're kind of a bit disappointed when it comes to trying to reach out to US counterparts and to say that these individuals are arbitrarily detained. So it's definitely something that we see as having an impact also on these individuals. And then maybe just in terms of kind of brainstorming about like way forward, I just want to mention briefly COP27 at COP28. I know Salma has been heavily involved in COP27, so I hope we'll get to hear from her also about some strategies afterwards. But As everybody knows, so COP27 was held in Egypt, and we saw also a lot of climate organizations, demanding no climate justice without civic space. And I think this was really a great kind of collaborative environment between organizations like ours, that focus more on, let's say, civil and political rights, and organizations working on the environment. And I think, obviously, in the context of the climate crisis and the energy crisis, we would like to see more of these collaborations, because obviously, like these, we operate as of now, sometimes a bit like, let's say, far away from each other. And I think there is definitely room for more collaboration, because there can be no climate justice without civic space. And COP28 is going to be in Dubai, of all places, in November 2023. And this is obviously a cause for concern, just because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. At COP27, the biggest number of fossil fuel lobbyists was actually from the UAE. So this is also an extra cause for concern for, for those working on more like environment, fossil fuel issues. But just like these are causes for concern, I also think that these are moments of opportunities for civil society organizations. And I definitely hope, and I'm confident, that a lot of NGOs and civil society actors are also going to be using these opportunities to raise awareness on certain human rights issues, including on the human rights defenders and peaceful dissidents that Bill mentioned earlier that are detained in the UAE.
Thanks for sharing more information about other worrisome trends happening currently, but also the potential that lies within working together, learning from each other, from past experiences. I think that's also something that we've touched upon in the second session or second panel. What can we learn from the World Cup in Qatar? What can we learn from COP27 in Egypt? And on that note, I would like to introduce Salma Al-Husseini, also longstanding ally, joining from Geneva. She's the Human Rights Council Program Manager for the International Service for Human Rights. She's leading strategic engagement and advocacy at the UN Human Rights Council. She's also been, really a leading force behind those joint statements that we've seen at the UN Human Rights Council on Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, Salma, every day you're kind of dealing with the UN diplomats and what's happening at the council. So from your perspective, well, how do you assess the current situation given the kind of changes that we've discussed here? And do you see new alleyways of, furthering our human rights work in this environment? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and thank you in particular for Al-Qist for the crucial and the important work that you do documenting the grave violations in Saudi Arabia, amplifying the voices of victims, and really pushing for accountability at the various levels, including at the UN. So you referred to the joint statement. So let me just start by mapping out, what was already done at the Council and where we are in terms of advocacy on the human rights situation in Saudi. So following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018, human rights organizations seized the momentum and advocated for a special session. While this was unsuccessful, we did manage to secure the first joint statement by a cross-regional group of 36 states. It was led by Iceland in March 2019. And the statement called for the release of human rights defenders, including naming 10 women human rights defenders. It condemned, of course, the murder of Khashoggi, called for investigations and accountability, and called on Saudi Arabia to ensure that everyone, including defenders and journalists, can freely and fully exercise their rights, freedom of expression, opinion, association, including in line without fear of reprisals, among other calls. And then the following session in June 2019, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings at the time, she presented to the Council her investigation into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And then following the trial in December 2019, she stated that those who ordered the executions not only walk free, but have been barely touched by the investigation and the trial. And then in September 2019, Australia delivered the second joint statement, also behalf on a cross-regional group of states, where they expressed the same concerns over the persecution and the intimidation of activists, and also the widespread torture, the extrajudicial killings, the enforced disappearances, unfair trials, arbitrary detention, and impunity. And it called on the Saudi government to end impunity, including for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, to accept visits by UN special experts, and to end the death penalty and ratify international human rights treaties. And then the following year, the third and final so far joint statement was delivered in September 2022 by Denmark, also cross-regional support with 33 states supporting, and it raised the same concerns, in particular also the use of counterterrorism measures against those exercising their rights to their human rights, and also violations against detainees, including torture, detention, disappearances, and also the denial of access to medical treatment and contact with families. So I just wanted to lay out these three statements, assuming not everyone is fully aware of what they were talking about. And so these statements brought a much needed attention to the concerns that the country is facing, and it identified very clear benchmarks for the Saudi government. And we have seen that the Saudi government at the time reacted to the spotlight and the international pressure, not in an attempt to improve the situation, but rather to kind of burnish its image. And so, as a result of this pressure, and of course because of the consistent and remarkable campaigning by the families, that they released several defenders, including, of course, Lujain al-Hadloul, and then they took some initial steps to improve the situation, to improve major human rights concerns relating to the guardianship system and the death penalty. But these were, of course, cosmetic changes. We have not seen so far any institutionalized or sustained improvements on these, the benchmarks identified in the statements relating to freedom of expression and human rights defenders. But on the contrary, what we have seen is that the situation is continuing to deteriorate, to get worse, and in particular with very harsh prison sentences against human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience. And so with the scale of continuing repression, there is also a continuing lack of access of independent monitors and international organizations to the country. And so what we are consistently saying to states, the diplomats in Geneva, is that the Saudi government's refusal to address this key concern of arbitrary detention of defenders, it demonstrates its lack of political will to actually genuinely improve the situation and to engage constructively with the Council. But so since then, human rights organizations have been advocating for follow-up to these joint statements and insisting on the need for establishing a monitoring and reporting mechanism on the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. And we have been saying that maintaining the pressure on the authorities, it's vital to ensure that the reforms, whatever steps they are taking, are institutionalized and they are maintained. And also that in order to achieve any meaningful, concrete, or systematic improvement, the international pressure has to be sustained. And we consistently also recall that the situation in Saudi Arabia meets what we call the objective criteria, which many governments at the Human Rights Council have committed to applying in both deciding when a situation merits the Council's attention, and also most importantly pledged to take leadership and responsibility in initiating action when such criteria are met. However, we are yet to see the political will of states, including those three who led on the three joint statements, Iceland, Denmark, and Australia, to move forward with a resolution to put the situation in Saudi Arabia on the Human Rights Council's agenda. And this is despite the situation getting worse and worse. And the fact that there was no follow-up, this has sent the wrong message to the Saudi authorities, who have increased the repression, and we can make a direct correlation between that and the lack of follow-up action at the council. Now, I want to move a bit towards a broader analysis of the dynamics at the council that are contributing also to this difficult situation of garnering the political will to move forward with a resolution. So the failure to renew the accountability mechanism on Yemen in October 2021, this set a very dangerous precedent at the Human Rights Council. It was the first resolution to fail, and it showed that members of the Human Rights Council are willing to end accountability mechanisms because of geopolitical interests and political pressure. And so what we are seeing is that a lot of states are wary of initiating country resolutions because of the risk of failure, as what happened in Yemen. However, it's not all bleak, because in the last session of the Human Rights Council, a group of states, mostly Western states, presented a resolution requesting a debate on the Office of the High Commissioner's report on the situation in Xinjiang in China, which report found crimes against humanity. And they did that despite the high risk of it failing. The resolution did fail in the end, but at least it provides a precedence of states willing to take the risk. And this is a very important argument to use, in particular with Western governments who have led and supported this initiative on China. And then another really important argument also that we are using with Western states is that using the response to the situation in Ukraine as an opportunity to promote a more principled, consistent, and objective response to violations and abuses in other contexts, including in Saudi Arabia, based on principles of non-discrimination, dignity, and solidarity, and also an opportunity to reform and strengthen the international accountability frameworks. And then another point I want to make is that it's also really important for us to be linking in our narratives and in our advocacy on Saudi Arabia the wholly inadequate political action or investment to address global climate crisis. And Julia, you mentioned that this was mentioned in the previous discussions, because it's very important, because the political support for the continued use of fossil fuels, which is exacerbated by energy crisis associated with the war in Ukraine, is, as we heard, empowering and contributing to impunity of regimes in oil-rich states like including in Saudi Arabia. And it's also threatening the safety and the work of human rights defenders working on the protection of the environment globally. And as was mentioned previously as well with the COP27, so this link between the climate justice and human rights, it was in unprecedented prominence at COP27 held in Egypt last month. And this was because of the significant civil society coordination, the increased solidarity between the human rights movement in Egypt and the climate justice movements across the world, using the COP27 event as an opportunity to highlight the repression and the abuse in the host state, so Egypt in this case, but we're also seeing that in the World Cup in Qatar. And so I think that the strategies and the coalitions that were built to use COP27 as an opportunity to highlight the repression and increase the pressure for change in Egypt can definitely be strengthened and used in the context of COP28 to happen in the Emirates. So we can be built on that cross-movement solidarity, both for COP28 in UAE, but also beyond. And I mean, we see that authoritarian regimes in our region, they learn and they help each other. And so we need to be working together across the region and beyond, and to be collectively building strategies that address the root causes of the human rights crisis in our region, which are all intrinsically linked. And so I really want us to be thinking about how we can use these moments of opportunity, both to strengthen our own movements and to and leverage them to at least at the very least to counter the false narratives, the PR campaign, and the propaganda of these authoritarian regimes. And I also think that we need to be diversifying our advocacy with states, and not to be putting all our energy in the Western allies of our governments, but to be looking more at governments from the global south, and in particular those who had recent significant changes of governments, such as in Colombia and Brazil, for example, both positive outcomes for environmental and rights protections. But we can only do so effectively if we start by building the relationships and the connections with the civil society movements in these countries. I mean, our struggles for human rights and climate justice, they are inseparable. And we all have a vested interest and shared struggles in ensuring that we are able to shape and influence our government policies to address the existential climate crisis. Now, coming back to the Council, and I'll end with that. At the Council, not all country-specific resolutions are led by Western states. There are Latin American countries that continue to lead on Nicaragua and Venezuela, for example. And so we need to be thinking of a long-term vision and a strategy of how to move beyond relying on Western states to lead on resolutions. And in particular, given the geopolitical context that we are discussing today, and their lack, just plainly their lack of political will to hold countries like Saudi Arabia accountable. And in the spirit of brainstorming and food for thought, I'm just going to put an idea out there for us to think about, because I've been thinking about this. I wonder, whether we should be developing a collective strategy at the Council for our region, as a region, because most situations require dedicated international accountability and monitoring and reporting mechanisms. And so rather than investing separately to get Saudi Arabia on the agenda, and then the Emirates and Bahrain, etc., which each of them require significant political capital and advocacy efforts, whether we want to think about or explore a collective mechanism that focuses on the Gulf countries, for example, and in particular on the issue of civic space, because we have to recognize that civic space is the fundamental core of any improvement in the human rights situation. And that's why one of the slogans of the organizing around the COP27 was that there can be no climate justice without an open civic space, no climate justice without human rights. And at the end of the day, we have to be also realistic and pragmatic. The Human Rights Council cannot fix the human rights situations itself. It's the civil society in the countries pushing their governments who have the power to do so. And so the role of the Human Rights Council can be to support civil society, to have the space, and to pressure the governments to open up the space, and in particular to end the patterns of reprisals, which are quite dominant in our region. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Salma, not just for providing background on what has been happening at the Human Rights Council over the past years, where we're now, but also providing ideas of what we could, do differently or add on top of what we're already doing to continue to advance human rights in the region. And apart, I think, from obviously forming bigger alliances, be it sort of cross-sectional with different groups such as, environmentalist groups, but also maybe trying to approach different and new allies, building new relationships with governments from southern countries, and not necessarily, those that we've been talking to mostly over the past years. And yeah, I think also the idea of having a collective strategy at the Human Rights Council, sort of a regional strategy, because as you say, it's also a matter of capacity and how much can you lobby on one individual country after the other? How about addressing the Gulf region together? Because there are a lot of shared issues, and I think civic space is really the one that stands out. And the fact that in those countries, people can't really hold their governments to account, and they can't really protest the actions of their governments without facing really harsh consequences, and that mostly means prison in the region. but yeah, I think these are great ideas of maintaining and potentially increasing pressure on the authorities beyond what we've been doing so far, lobbying sort of political political stakeholders that we've been in touch with, and also obviously trying to engage businesses that invest in the region, which I think is another big part of how we're trying to up the pressure on the authorities and how different actors can have leverage on the Saudi authorities. But I would like to really open the floor to further suggestions, to questions, because we're joined by lots of human rights activists and experts here in the room also for ideas that I'm happy to note down as a bit of a brainstorming collection of how we can go forward. And Lina Al-Hathloul, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this very interesting panel. My question is to you, Bill. I agree with everything you said. I just maybe have a little issue with when we say that the Middle East or the Gulf countries are more stable than the other countries around it. Because the thing is, who is it stable for? I mean, when you get kidnapped from the streets, when you find out that your son has been executed on the news, when your whole city is being demolished, when there are thousands of people who are forcibly disappeared, for me, that's not stability. So it's only stability for our regimes and maybe for the allies of our regime. So I think that, it bothers me a bit when we say that these countries are stable, but I mean, feel free to answer anything you have.
Do you want to react to that?
Of course, yeah. I think, Lena, what I was attempting to say, and I didn't say it very well, was that the perception among the Western powers, Britain, the United States, they look at it and they say, oh, that's a stable region. The Gulf is stable because they see Iraq, they see the situation in Libya, and that's their impression. I agree with you. Of course, there can be no real security, genuine security or stability when, as you've described, people are arrested in the middle of the night by balaclava thugs, or they're attacked indiscriminately. If you look at what the IDF is doing now, how it's ramping up its use of live fire, really appalling acts that are being carried out in the name of Israeli security. Well, that's not security either. So yeah, no, I emphatically agree with you, and I think the call for, if I may, the call for collective engagement is really important, because COP28 is coming up very, very quickly, and I think yes, that connection between the human rights and environmental degradation is really important to make, and so that's why I think that collective action needs to be really undertaken. And to come back to my point that Miriam said to me, is this burnout factor. I mean, it's very concerning because people have struggled for so long, and in the context of what you've described, which in the past decade has become so much more difficult. Because I can remember when I was still at the BBC, I wrote a piece about a Muslim Brotherhood leader in jail in Cairo. This is in 2008, and his medication, his diabetic, was being withheld. I wrote that piece. The day later, his medication was restored. That was then. That wouldn't happen now. That's what's really, disturbing. But again, I don't want to be, a Jeremiah and a total pessimist, because I look at that. You mentioned Bolsonaro. He was defeated. If you look what's happened to Trump. I want to do a song called 3 Times a Loser, because he lost the midterms in 2018, he lost in 2020, he lost the midterms this year. And you can see the steam coming out of the Trump balloon, which means that these Republicans, these gutless Republicans, some of them are starting to poke their heads up above the parapet because they see opportunities. Well, equally, I think that, the human rights commune society should see opportunities, because there is, particularly in America, there is this kind of shrinking, at least for the moment, of this authoritarian drift. And we'll be interested to see what happens in Israel. I have very good, very decent, honorable Israeli friends who are appalled, what's happened to their country. Maybe things will shift there too. The other thing I wanted to say, and then I'll shut up, is when I think about who is carrying the fight, you know, there are so many women involved in this, in the fight. I mean, I think of you, Lena, of Miriam Al-Hawasha, of Arish, and so many others, and many of them in prison, as we know. And there is common ground, I think, women's rights issues right across the Gulf. You can go to Qatar, you can go to Kuwait, where honor killings are still happening, you know, basically allowed. Saudi Arabia, of course. Bahrain is, you know, maybe it's the best of a bad situation. So I think that, and again, to come back to something Mustafa was saying, it was like working on the ground. I mean, this is an area of shared concern, and women are, you can see it. I mean, there's some very good work being done in Kuwait, for example, leading on the honor killing situation. So I would say look at that as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please, another question from the audience.
Hello. Thank you very much. I've loved all the talks. I have a quick question. It's terribly sad that there's no civic society in the Gulf as a whole, but it's completely deliberate. Obviously, why would any government want civic society? It suits them very well not to have it. So how can we open those chinks of light? Where would we start with that?
I don't know if one of the, I mean, I can comment on that, but I guess I would also like to floor to our speakers online. So feel free to come in if you have something to say to that, if you heard the question.
Maybe I can just quickly say that it's yeah, it's a very good point that you're making, and actually the answer is, I don't know if it's that optimistic, because ultimately for civic space to be present in these countries, it needs to be allowed. You know, currently in Saudi, in the UAE, in many others as well, like it's like free expression is criminalized. Certain you know, associations and groups have been banned, and so this, like, these like kind of systemic issues, and you know, the legal framework like also needs to change. And unfortunately, because most of these countries, you know, don't have a parliament, or don't have like a proper like legislative body, you know, with real powers, it's really hard, because at the end of the day, the decision is, you know, in the hands of the executive. And you know, are we going to see, you know, some royal decrees tomorrow promoting, you know, protecting freedom of expression, freedom of association? Like, I don't think any of us can really be optimistic on that. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, it is a difficult question. But I think this is why the role of NGOs outside of diaspora you know, is also extremely important, because at the moment it's kind of the only alternative for this sort of work, or you know, documenting abuses and kind of speaking up. It's the only way that can be done at the moment.
Julia, if I can just add on that as well. No, fully agree, and it's a very, very good question. And I agree with what Ines was saying, but I would add on that also international pressure, and using the international community as a leverage, because while these states are not in need of money, like in my country, for example, they are in need of their image, and they do invest significantly in the PR campaigns. And so really all the advocacy of exposing that situation and just exposing how it's absolutely unacceptable, and using all the opportunities that they use to whitewash their image, to highlight the lack of civic space, and really focusing on that specific issue to increase the political cost of that situation continuing. At least it might not change it, but at least the political cost can be higher.
Probably to add on that as well is to create space and to ensure that the activists that are operating in the diaspora are being heard, because we've really seen over the past years lots of the activists from the Gulf actually coming together, sort of agreeing on joint initiatives. I mean, in the context of Saudi Arabia, we've seen the National Assembly Party, NAS. It's like a pro-democracy movement of Saudis all around the world, in the diaspora, also in the country. Obviously, they cannot be named, but to agree on basic principles of rights and freedoms, developing a new vision for their country, alternative to what the government is doing. And I think it's important that these voices are being heard, and that governments also make space and time to listen and speak with these activists in the diaspora. Another question from the audience, Drury, please.
It's more of a comment and an invitation for reaction from Ines and Salma, as well as from you, Julia, and others in the room. 6 points, 6 very quick points. Sorry. COP28, we've talked about it. We've got to get together to do stuff together. Bill, you may be aware that our former colleague, a colleague of ours in the US, has started some action. Freedom Forward, Sanjeev Berry's. We're all kind of cooperating. We'll get something. I personally really want to see us on the ground. I know that a lot of people cannot be on the ground, will not go be on the ground. I would like to see us, civil society, somewhere making noise. 2, the IPU in May 2023 in Manama. Again, Ines, Salma, our organizations, I'd really like us to coordinate something to make some noise with the IPU about Gulf, and bear in mind, Salma, about the idea about treating the Gulf as a kind of separate unit, as a subset of its own thing. Yeah, this is very much in the context of that notion. 3, women's rights. Again, possibility of new allies. Citizenship. Women cannot confer citizenship across the Gulf, and it begs for new allies, and I think there are new allies to be had in that issue. International business, my 4th point, 4th of 6 points. Sorry about this. I worked with an Iranian NGO, Justice for Iran. We successfully used the OECD mechanisms against an Italian telecoms body to get them to disinvest from Iran. I don't know whether they did it in the end, but again, it's something I'd like us all to consider using those. The 5th point, yesterday, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights and Gulf Center for Human Rights got ECOSOC accreditation. Look, why can't we collectively somehow, for Al-Qist, for, I don't know, Salam, for others, try and adapt whatever Khalid and Nidal and others did in order to try and get that accreditation for ourselves? You get ECOSOC accreditation as an NGO, you can go in without having to rely on others. I think Salma's organization's got it. I'm not sure that MENA Rights, not yet. Okay, it's in the pipeline. Soon, good. The last point. Look, another entry point is transparency and corruption. It's something that's come out a lot in Kuwait, where there's a slightly more open environment, and I've done some work with Transparency International in Kuwait, and the amount of corruption that's come out in respect to Italy is something. So those are 6 points. Salma, Ines, Al-Qist, Alex, Nabhan, for all of us to consider.
Because we are out of time.
Thank you, and I'll make it quick because I am cognizant of the time. So there's been a lot of discussion about the intersectionality between different sections like human rights and climate, and I agree that there is definitely a lot of connection between those. But my question is, in addition to working on, so some issues you have to work outside the current system because it's impossible, whether that's political dissent or human rights. Like, you can't advocate for these things in these countries, in these regimes, because there are very obvious consequences, unfortunately. However, what about issues such as energy reform, climate change, where there is some space at the margins? It might be cosmetic in some cases, but in other cases, you have to take what little success you can do. So my question is there a value in doing that? And on the other hand, is there a danger that if you combine that sort of work, climate change reform or whatever, with human rights issues, you risk being sort of ostracized and sort of removed from those processes. So, yeah, in addition to working with the outside.
Okay. You want to answer, Dina? Okay. If you have a comment to say to that, and then we'll pass it on to Ines and Salma and try to wrap up quickly.
Express your opinion. So for them, you're either with them or against them. We have Al Zamel, who is one prominent economist in Saudi Arabia. He just commented on the economic side of Vision 2030, and he is still in prison, and he's been sentenced to decades in prison. So even when it comes to not so political, we would say, issues, you can still land in jail, because it's all about freedom of expression at least in Saudi Arabia. And again, you're either with them or against them. So if MBS wants to do his greenwashing thing, you cannot even criticize how he does it, you know? So there's just no space for you to express your opinion on whatever issue it is, unfortunately.
Maybe just to add to that, that's true. Actually, we've also seen Omani activists, who promoted climate positive change, being jailed. So there is definitely a danger. I would, for some last reflections on maybe the points that Rory made, and thank you for that, hand over again to Ines and Salma if you want to answer to some of that, to comment, any closing remarks, please feel free.
Thank you. I'll be very, very brief. I think there is a lot of things that I wish we had more time to discuss more in depth. But very briefly on the issue of businesses that Julia, Drury, you kind of brought up. Yes, I feel like this is definitely an avenue that we have so far been maybe underusing a little bit. And I think again, there is maybe also a lack of, kind of learning from our peers, learning from Iranian NGOs. This is personally not necessarily something our organization is doing, and I think there is definitely maybe some experiences that have been gained by other organizations, other people in other contexts that we could benefit from. But I wanted to highlight just a final thought on what Lina was mentioning regarding stability. We actually recently have been contacted by a company that I won't name that is doing its due diligence because they're considering going to Saudi. And, there are more due diligence laws that are being adopted across the world. And I think this is something that hopefully a good trend that we're seeing, and maybe a space for civil society also to engage more with companies outside. But I think what's important, or at least the main point that we made, is that everything is so unpredictable in these countries. Literally, you have no legislative power. The judiciary is not independent. Everything is in the hands of the executive. So as a business, do you really want to go into that very unpredictable environment where, tomorrow they can just decide by royal decree to close down, I don't know, your office, or arrest your staff? I'm sure there are many people who've ended up in prison in the UAE just because of business disputes. And I think businesses, in my opinion, are just maybe a little too, I don't want to say naive, but these countries are just extremely unpredictable. And I think it can also be another way for us to kind of leverage and use that sort of entry point to also raise awareness on these issues in Gulf countries.
So I fully agree with what Ines was said. Yeah. Okay. No. What I'm just gonna add on that is that ICTR is part of the Business Network on Civic Space and Freedoms, and working with businesses to ensure that human rights defenders are consulted and protected in the context of their opposition. So it's definitely work that we can, a space that we can connect and work on. And that also relates to the point that that was made about transparency and corruption, because that's also a language that businesses understand, and that's one of the arguments that ISHR has been pushing in this framework, that a safe and enabling environment for human rights defender is good for business, to use the business lingo. And then on the ECOSOC status, yes, it's actually sad that we have to celebrate something like that. It's a given, but the NGO committee is quite dysfunctional, to say the least. But again, ISHR is significantly invested in supporting NGOs to go through that process and to lobby, and we continue to work with KUST and others on that. On COP28, ISHR is also of course going to be supporting the movements from the region in their organizing, but I just really want to stress that the leadership has to come from the movements in the country and the regions, and us as those working in international groups are there to amplify rather than take the lead. And then I'll close with a final point about the intersectionality and on human rights and climate change. Like as Julia and Lina put it, it's this is what they said. It's this false dichotomy between you lose access to either or. We're past that, right? And COP27 has showed us that we're past that point. Climate justice and human rights are interlinked, and you cannot have one without the other. So I would really push back on this narrative of you're going to lose access, or you're not going to be able to do change. No, it's without the protesters at COP27 were saying, not just in COP27 but across the world at the Global Day of Action, we want system change, not climate change, and that can't be by settling or looking for breadcrumbs. Thank you, and thank you again for the event.
Thank you very much, Salma. Thank you, Ines. Bill, I don't want to exclude you. If you have any closing remarks, I also pass on to you again before wrapping up.
All right, that's very kind. I really will keep it very, very short. I think there have been many good ideas that have emerged just in this hour or so. And I think that the collective will and the collective energy is the way forward, and coupled with the enormous resilience. I mean, I think that it's important that one doesn't lose sight of those qualities, and I think they're here in abundance. But yeah, and I think a very good point too about business. I mean, there are business people who will listen, and again, I reiterate on the issue, and Drew's mentioned it again, is that women's rights. So look to these areas and keep fighting.
Thank you very much, Bill. And yeah, I agree. I think this hour of conversation has brought about quite a lot of new ideas that we have well noted, and we will make sure to have follow-up conversations on that. But what also is clear is that we need to continue the day-to-day work that we do. So I would like to thank everyone here, Salma at the Human Rights Council, MENA Rights Group, documenting a lot of individual cases, raising them with international legal mechanisms, but also Bill, your analysis and you being a long-standing supporter for human rights and an ally in the media. I would like to thank everyone in the room who is part of that larger human rights movement. And well, to be continued. Thank you everyone for your attention, for your interest, and have a great evening.